Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Sullivan. I'm the chair of the Board of Accountancy. I am calling this public meeting of the State of Oregon Board of Accountancy to order. Today is Friday, December 15th, 2023, and it is 8:30 a.m.
You have the wrong chair agenda in front of you.
I was wondering that, but I did catch the date while I was.
I was like, oh, that's a September.
I can keep going there. So this meeting is being held in person at the board offices on 200 Hawthorne Avenue Southeast, Suite D 450, Salem, Oregon 97301. This meeting is being recorded. Zoom participation is also enabled. If you are participating in this meeting by Zoom, please be sure to mute your microphone and unmute only when you are called upon to speak. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, the meeting will be paused until they are resolved. I will now take roll call of members and guests, and I'll go ahead and just start around the table and move around the room before we go to Zoom. So again, Joe Sullivan, board chair.
Rob Valdivia, vice chair.
Martin Piccioni, executive director.
Logan Steele, board member.
Jeremiah Leopard, board staff.
Haley Lyon, board member.
Andrew Barlow, board staff.
Jason Robinson, board treasurer.
Angie Hunt, board legal counsel.
Nancy Young Oliver, board member.
Perfect.
Mary Lou Varner, board staff.
Matthew Stallheim, board staff.
Rita Dennington, DAS HR. Sherry McPherson, OSCPA staff.
Gary Holton, OSCPA vice chair.
Thank you. I think that's everyone in the room. So I'll move to Zoom. I'll just call on people as I see them on the screen. So Tanya.
Tanya Moffett, BOAC Chair.
Good morning, Tanya. Stu.
Stuart Morris, board member.
Okay, and then it looks like John Brams. I think you're on mute, John.
That's me.
Perfect. Thank you. Is there anyone else on Zoom I haven't called on? Okay, not hearing anyone else. Keep going. I think I've got another copy of the agenda here that I can jump to. So
Sorry.
no, we're good.
Angie, is this the right one? Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
and I think I'll just note too that I think we're going to have Dan Dustin from NASPA join a little later, and then Dr. Elizabeth Almer is going to join here at some point this morning, who is chair of our pipeline committee. We'll move on to item number 2, which is agenda review and approval. I think, Martin, if I'm not mistaken, there's a few items on number 3 that we might need to defer.
Yes, so I would respectfully ask that we defer 3 out of the 4 items until we do our call next week on Thursday, which is items 3A, 3B, and 3D, so that I can get that before the board. I just ran out of steam to do that this morning. And then I would also respectfully ask that we add 2 new business items. For some reason, I forgot that we keep having this pipeline committee now, and we have a report that's due from the pipeline committee. So I would respectfully ask that we add a report item for Dr. Elizabeth Almer onto the agenda. She's kind of standing by whenever we need her to kind of zoom in, as long as we give her 30 to 45 minutes notice. And I would also love, under new business, if we could add a brief discussion on kind of closing the loop on the whole wall certificate piece. There is one more remaining piece of business kind of that's at the policy level that I wanted to discuss with the board. And if we could add that under 8E, that would be amazing.
Okay, so again, just to clarify, that was 3A, B, and D that we're going to defer, correct?
Yep.
And then on new business, we would add 8F, which would be the report from Dr. Almer, and then 3G, which would be the wall certificate discussion.
And 8E, yes. 8E, the wall certificate, yes.
Okay. So I think, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Perfect. Second, any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Abstentions? Hearing none. That passes. Okay, we'll move on then to item number 3. And again, we just deferred 3 of those items, so we just have the meeting summary from September 29th. So that's just supplemental, correct? No motions needed. Okay, any discussion or questions on the meeting summary? Okay, hearing none. Okay, so we'll move on to item number 4, public comment. So are any members of the public who wish to comment, please raise your hand in the room or use the Zoom raise hand feature. If I do call on you for comment, you will be permitted to address the board for 3 minutes and staff will unmute you so you can speak. As chair, I reserve the right to end your comment early and have staff mute you if your comment does not pertain to the authority given to this board by the legislator to regulate the CPA profession and public accountancy firms in this state. That must be added on a few other experiences we've had. So anyone wishing to make public comment? Okay, not seeing anybody. Kendra, it looks like you just joined. Would you mind just unmuting yourself and kind of announcing for roll call here?
Yeah, absolutely. Kendra Beck, I'm with DAS CFO. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you for joining. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. And folks, just for context, while we have Kendra on, so thank you for hopping on briefly. I know you have a super busy day, but Kendra is essentially my new partner at DAS, helping me with all the budget related policy issues. And she's going to be my partner developing the board's budget proposal for 2025, for the 2025-27 biennium. So this is just somebody who you should at least meet once, because these are the super critical folks for me behind the scenes that actually help me get the board's work done. She's brand new to DAS and her role. And so we're going to partner together on our budget process. And there's a little bit more on that later in the meeting. I don't know, Kendra, if I can just put you on the spot for a second. Did you already get that document that the agency heads got yesterday and the new budget process?
Which one are you referring to? I got it.
It came out from the governor's office yesterday with a new budget process, updated budget process and timelines.
Yes, yeah, I did get
Okay, awesome. We'll talk.
that. Alrighty.
Okay, well, thanks again for joining us, Kendra, and I swear for a bunch of CPAs, we're a lot of fun, so. Right, so I didn't hear any public comments, so we will keep on moving to item number 5, report of the OSCPA.
Thank you very much. There's so much, Sherry McPherson, there's so much going on that I gave Gary a breath of relief here today. I should say it that way. So from a business standpoint, Society CPE is geared up again. Interestingly, with the online programming, we're on a year-round CPE cycle. We don't quite have these peaks and valleys as much as we used to. So I think that's a positive in many ways for members and licensees. But we do have our live programming and hybrid programming that's geared up right now. So of course, a big segment of members or a large segment of members are getting ready for upcoming tax season. So there's a lot of that type of preparation going on. We have the Winter Governmental Accounting and Auditing Conference coming up for those on the municipal side. And a lot of corporate transparency CPE right now. That's a very, very big issue the profession is dealing with. I know that I've been in correspondence with AICPA. We did a sign on with AICPA, other CPA societies too, asking for the extent or the 30 days to be moved to a 90-day. So really happy to see that going about, but there's some other activity going on with that right now too. And so I'm hopeful that we'll end up with the profession having a little bit of a breath, but if not, it's going to keep folks busy. A lot of CPAs, a lot of attorneys were not familiar with the topic. So it's something that's out there in the space with a lot of conversation right now. Looking at a few other things too, ethics, of course. When we start looking at some activities, I would like to thank Joe and Martin for being at the OSCPA professional issues update this last week. That was very much appreciated, like usual, and it's an annual invite. There's so much to talk about this year. I've had really great feedback. And when I talk about great feedback too, I just really want to tell you the positive comments coming in from members. I have opportunity to talk to a lot of members with corporate transparency. That has definitely lifted up the number of calls that I'm having with members, which also gives the opportunity for a lot of conversation about, you know, changes that impact them from Board of Accountancy rules changes, et cetera. So please know, I know that I've, you know, over time I've asked, you know, and requested for some things, and I would just say, I thank you so much for all of the efforts that you've put forth. Also, I know it's a little bit unusual, but to have OSCPA and OAIA directly on laws and rules as committee members, that's been very much appreciated. And at the same time, I would just say, for me, it's been a great learning experience because, as you know, 42 years as an advocate on the CPA side, I don't have the compliance things in the same way. I'm very, you know, understanding of them. But to live them on the opposite side has been a lovely experience too. So thank you for that. You know, just making sure that we go through things like public meeting processes, et cetera. So that's a lot of positives all the way around on that. Pipeline, I have been guest at, or I was guest at the meeting yesterday, and I'm, you know, here to support Martin and team on any of the, you know, questions and conversations coming through on that. Our staff advisor, that's the primary liaison to our educational foundation. She'll be in some of the meetings with me just because of you know, how she moves through the action process, I'll call it, before we get to scholarships. And then of course, Darlene Bowles, who is CPA, she'll be with me periodically as well, just so we can make sure that we're all, you know, communicating internally, and so that way we're on the same pathway as what you're needing for needs. So looking out for some other things, I've been working with Martin on a number of projects too. We talk regularly, so we're working through some of those things. And oh, going back to the pipeline committee too, I know on that, we're just looking to make sure that, you know, anything that's coming up on that we can move through, because there is complexity to that, so we recognize that. So that'll be coming. And I think that's probably plenty, but thank you very, very much.
And Sherry, I would just add, the board has discussed several times about kind of the reinvigorated partnership with the Board of Accounts. It really has seemed to change. I've been on and off the OSCPA board a number of times, so really appreciate kind of the partnership that we've been able to have.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we appreciate the partnership as well, and look forward to continue to build on that. So, thank you. So we can move on. 6, I do not see Amanda yet. Did we go too fast? Maybe we could.
I think if we can circle back to her, because I don't have any indication from her that she's not able to attend. So if we could hold that item,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
We can circle back to item 6, report of the OAIA. So hopefully Amanda has time to join us at some point this morning. And then 7, I think we've beat the time. Dan has not joined as well. And so before we figure out what we'll do with that time, I always look at the end of the agenda. It says estimated 4 p.m. I look at that as a personal challenge and say, we're going to beat that. So we'll continue down that path. But Martin, do you think, as far as, you know, with about 15 minutes here?
Well, what I could do is, and I can just do it on the fly, is I could try to take off agenda item 16 and just cover my own report. I want to do that and just kind of slide that in so we can just keep moving through. You know, I'll just kind of, I always do this a little bit from the hip, but basically it actually works out well doing this right after Sherry's and the OSCPA update report, because a big part of what I do is externally facing, whether it's with, you know, OSCPA or OAIA and candidates. So I just want to say the engagement is very, very deep at all levels. That is ongoing, and I think it's very much appreciated. We've had a number of mass communications go out with respect to the rules pieces, which for technical reasons, I cannot discuss until our meeting on Thursday, because we are not supposed to be discussing the rules that are in progress right now, but just say that as part of getting that stuff out the door, there's always feedback that is appreciated by candidates. And we also had some feedback, I think, from the firms around the initial, shooting out of emails, not just on firm renewals, but letting the firm specifically know, here's what we've been doing with rules changes, here's what we're doing on candidates, repackaging these pieces in like two separate presentations. One is, here's really a package that just talks about what all we've done on the candidate side of the equation to make it easier for people to move through the pipeline. I think it made that information a lot more accessible. It also allowed me to partner with Elizabeth and Logan to kind of get this out into the higher ed piece a little bit easier, without cluttering it up with other rules changes that are not going to be as relevant to the candidates themselves. So personnel, we already know that we're fully staffed, so I'm super, super excited about that piece. Legislatively, probably the biggest update is what happened yesterday. Yesterday, there was a call of all agency heads by DAS and the governor's office, and one of the items for discussion was a updated budget process. And I think it very much speaks to what I think we started covering at the prior board meeting already a little bit, which is that this governor's office, and particularly the governor herself, is very, very much intending on really holding agencies accountable and really partnering with agencies on how well are you doing in your performance? What do we need to watch? What do we need to fix? One way that played out in that document yesterday, very specifically, is that they're taking quite a bit longer and starting quite a bit earlier to engage with us on legislative concepts and budget proposals. So I actually have a deadline now on January 22nd already to do a very initial high-level overview to the governor's office about what it is that we intend to bring to the 2025 legislative session. Good news here is this is where our work really pays off already, because the reality is that because we've already done so much work at the LRC and the board level, and because we've already tried to and didn't make it, but now it's really paying off, getting at least 2 items into the 24 session, right? We effectively have 3 legislative pieces blessed already by the governor's office, right? So just to be really clear what I'm talking about here, that's the inactive status initiative, the board composition change, and the conceptual outline of what we're trying to do through the pipeline committee. All 3 of those already have essentially the early blessing of the governor's office. And of course, that means in that approach that's now getting rolled out that there's still ongoing conversations about all of those pieces, but it means that none of those 3 things are new when I need to go to the governor's office on January 22nd. And that is huge because it gives us a lot of headwind, right? It does mean still that with respect to work that hasn't reached the board yet, but that we know, and Ray Johnson will join us a little bit later to talk about the update from the pipeline committee. But it means that there's still some pieces that will likely come from not the pipeline committee, the laws and rules committee. There's still some pieces that I think are likely to emerge out of laws and rules for potentially additional legislative work, right? Some of that are statutory cleanup issues, particularly around 673, 320, and the attest language in there. If we can kind of figure out our way through and really come up with a decent proposal to bring to the board. And I think we still have to do a little bit of analysis around the piece that we've talked about here very much in outline form, which is this interest on potentially permitting a change to firm ownership structure by opening a pathway for potentially employee stock ownership plans inside the minority ownership of public accounting firms. We still have to do some analysis on that front as to whether we can do that without statutory changes or not. That's probably one of the most urgent pieces of work we need to do, because if the answer is yes, then it would be really good to know that in the next few months. So those are the things that I will essentially on January 22, which is, a lot, it's several months sooner than I normally would have to have these conversations within the governor's office. Those are the pieces that essentially will go on what in governmental terms is known as placeholder status, right? So where I can put a placeholder in the conversation saying, here are these things that we're working on, but they're not quite ready for prime time and discussion with the governor's office yet. But I will give them a commitment, and this is the key part here for both the LRC and this board, that we will do the work we need to do by May and June to either figure out that we really want to pursue them and put enough meat on the bone that we know what that looks like and what it is that we're asking for, or say we're not ready, right? Because what they will not do, from what I understand from yesterday, is they will become a lot less supportive of allowing agencies to have placeholders in the system much after June. They want to be a lot more organized and kind of have less hectic and last minute conversations going into the 2025 session, right? And a lot of that makes a lot of sense. So there is a lot more partnership and a lot more conversation in this process with the governor's office. But the good news for this board is we are super ready for this. This is not bad news for us, even though I will admit the deadline came as a significant surprise to me yesterday. And I was initially like, what? January 22nd, right? But I pretty much relaxed inside a few minutes saying, this is actually not going to be a problem for us to actually, handle that difference in process. So that was kind of a pretty interesting development yesterday. The other piece that I can briefly cover in terms of my report is, I don't know if all of you had a chance to take a look at the key performance measure report that I did put into the system here. And I wanted to, rather than go over it, because you can all see what's in there, what I wanted to do briefly cover is the context and how I intend to use it, right? Because at a super high level, when you looked at this, you'd probably say, this doesn't look all that great, right? And quite frankly, that was actually the point of doing this, right? The point of doing this was capturing a year where we knew a whole bunch of stuff was still gonna be off kilter, right? Because we were still rebuilding staff. There was partial impacts because it partially captured the time when Jeremiah was still doing licensing as opposed to compliance work, which then impacts all the measures on that side of the equation, right? So the message here isn't, hey, these are great outcomes for performance measures. What this really is, for me, is part of a two-part strategy, right? One was, let's, number one, get back in the saddle and report data. You may recall that I had to do something super embarrassing at this point about roughly a year ago, because in our last key performance measure report, I couldn't even report data on our customer service measure because of all the messes that we had and the disconnect with SurveyMonkey and then deleting our data, right? So part of this was just getting back in the saddle and having something to report. But the really kind of the major goal, and Jeremiah can validate this from conversations that I've had with him, is this was really about establishing a baseline and then capturing data for the fiscal year ending June 30th. And essentially the goal is to then be able to say by fall of next year, here is our, and I'll use the accounting term, suckish level KPMs from the year ending June 30th, right? And I will view that as a baseline and say, how much did we improve during the fiscal year ending June 30th of 2024? And essentially start at least being able to build the story of, hey, we're coming back from, this is how we're coming back. This is where we were. This is the initial report that we just published for through June 30th of 2023. Here is now how we're doing in comparison through the year ending June 30th, 2024. So it's a very much, not that we're, super proud of what's on those KPMs, but it's really about helping us build that story about how we're coming back. And with a very deliberate goal that I'm also working on with staff internally on how we can make sure that we look a lot better on the report that we're going to need to produce by September of next year, by September of 2024, that will capture essentially the following year. And by the way, I'm not fully done with that strategy. That's the must part, right? Because every agency must do that report. What I also want to emphasize, and actually, Raul may remember this because you and I shared the shared experience of being in front of the legislature, I believe, in our last budget hearing together, right? What I always do in budget hearings for any agency that I represent is that I then voluntarily run an additional set of numbers that's a lot more current than data ending June 30th of 2024, right? Legislators love that stuff, right? Because number one, you're going above and beyond. Number two, you're giving them much more current data. It also gives us more time to show even more how much more we are improving, not just through June 30th, but let's say on some measures through December 31st, right? So that's the goal, right? Because there's two things we must be able to go to the legislature with in 2025 as a backdrop to the ask, right? One is we've done what we can within our resources, and that has two layers. One is the operational one that's captured on this report that's saying, hey, we're coming back, we're rebuilding. All these metrics are starting to improve. They may still not be quite where we want them to be, but that we can say we're continually rebuilding and we're continually getting better. That has to be part one of the story. Part two, we're well on the way of already being able to say, which is that at the policy and the rules level, we are doing everything we can under our own power through the Laws and Rules Committee and through the board action to essentially tackle what we need to do for the profession with respect to reducing barriers for applicants and barriers for the profession, right? So that we can then say, we literally have done everything we can under our own power, and here are the pieces we now need your help with. And that will give us credibility and support in a legislature. And that's kind of how that hangs together. And for me, at a board meeting, I much prefer to kind of talk about how these pieces connect rather than spend time with you on individual performance measures. That doesn't mean I'm not happy to take questions about individual measures, but my preference is to first lay out the context of why this stuff matters and how it actually builds into kind of the communication and the legislative strategy for the agency. So I hope that makes sense. Don't know if there's questions around that.
Not hearing any questions, and I think, did you have an operations update or Andrew?
Andrew, did you want to lead that, or do you want to hold? I don't want to put you on the spot. We do have Dan Dustin here, so you have a choice. Do you want to? Are you ready for an operational update?
Yeah, we
Cool.
can do that. Are we talking about the wall certificates at this time?
No, that's a separate item. That's a
Okay.
policy item.
Right now we are done as far as completing renewals. We'll be lapsing people officially on Monday and Tuesday and sending out letters. Our numbers right now that we got that do not intend to renew was 74 active that are relapsing, 228 and 60 inactive, and 120 retired. Total renewals were 32 or just under 3,300. Audits for the prior year, we are going to be tackling after we get the lapse letters out to identify the did not respond to the NASBA letters.
Yep, that's something we're gonna have to bring to the next board meeting because we're still working through how that whole NASBA process works. We had a whole bunch of people essentially not completing the process where we can't actually tell whether they're in compliance or not and what happened there. So it's a little bit of a noodly problem for us. So we're gonna have to probably come back to you in the February board meeting to figure out, okay, here's our data analysis, here's what we can tell. What do you want us to do, about that going forward? Because we don't want to just hammer people, quite frankly. It's a bit of a different process this time, and it clearly created issues that we don't normally see in, if we have that process in-house in terms of failure to complete and non-responsiveness. Because I have a very hard time believing that licensees have suddenly become that unresponsive to the board. That's not normal. So I want to dig a little bit into this before we come up, as a team, quite frankly. I want to look at this both with the licensing and the compliance team and come up with some analysis and recommendations that we can bring to the February board around that piece.
And then with exams, we did have a sharp decline in first-time exams. I think that might be expected with the rollover. We had only one new candidate that was a first-time exam from September 29th to today. But we did have 293 retake.
Oh, good.
293.
Yeah.
So the prior, I was just writing this down. So what was reported on the last board meeting, retakes were at 343 and first time was 125 between June to the September board meetings. And the only thing I had left was talking about the future audit for the 2023 renewal season
Yeah.
on.
I think we should probably combine that at the
Okay.
February board so that we can do it all together, all at once.
Cool. All right, yeah, thank you, Andrew. So that will take care of item 16. So with that, we're 9:02, and it looks like Dan has joined us, so we're going to circle back to item number 7 on the agenda, or board work session. So we'll start with 7A, the NASBA presentation from Dan Dustin. So Dan, can you hear us okay?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you for joining us this morning.
Okay. Do I have the ability to share a screen? Does that help? I know you guys received the deck, but certainly I can talk through the screen if you have the ability to view that.
We're working on it right now, Dan.
He's good to go if you'd like to share.
You should be able to have sharing capability now.
Okay. You should see the AICPA NASBA heading or slide.
Yes.
First, I want to thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you today to talk about the ELE program. And I saw in the appointment, Martin also would like me to talk a little bit about NASBA's professional licensure task force, and I'll update you once we get through this slide deck. The ELE program is a joint initiative of NASBA and the AICPA. It was really focused on trying to address some of the concerns we had heard from the student population. It was really focused on the hurdles that they were talking about in reaching the 150 hours of education for licensure. That included the lack of resources to complete the extra 30 hours once they had their baccalaureate degree, both in terms of the cost of education. And sometimes you may read that a master's degree costs $30,000 to $50,000 or more, depending on where the student goes to school. And also the opportunity cost that by requiring them to go to school costs them the time that they would otherwise be working and earning a living. Also, the lack of awareness. Some students believe they only have the ability to take a master's degree in order to meet the 150 hours requirements. Others struggle to identify how they can do that. So we thought that a program would help. And also the lack of attraction to the profession, whether it's the global view of the profession not being exciting and understanding the things that we do, whether it's salaries for individuals starting the profession or work-life balance, all things that have an impact on students being interested in becoming CPAs. So when we sat down and talked about this, we really wanted to provide flexibility to the student in order to meet the 150 hours for licensure. We also wanted to increase accessibility, whether it was underrepresented populations and certainly the diverse student population that's out there. At the same time, we wanted to produce qualifying academic credit through this program. We started out with three main principles. And what's interesting is these principles that were adopted about 18 months ago when we first started talking about this program have really been adopted with respect to other initiatives that continue to go on to this day, including what NASBA's Professional Licensure Task Force is looking at, as well as the AICPA's National Pipeline Advisory Group. And I can touch on that too if you want a little bit. But with respect to ELE, we wanted it to be cost effective for the student. We wanted to provide a program that would provide up to 30 hours of academic credit with rigor. And then we also wanted to be scalable by firm size. And really the scalability is something important. One of the other things that's out there right now, and you may be aware of it, is the experiential learning model, where a few of the larger firms have partnered with a college or university to create an experiential learning model. In that case, in those models, the firm is paying the full tuition cost for the students who are participating. What we wanted to do was to make sure that this program is scalable to firms of all sizes. So we really looked to partner with a college or university that could offer the program at $150 per credit hour. So the journey through the program, an individual graduates with their baccalaureate degree and their core accounting courses completed, but fewer than 150 hours. And throughout the last 4 or 5 years, as we worked with the CPA Evolution Initiative, and that's going to be launching in the next couple of weeks. Today's the last day to take the old exam, except under emergency situations. We really wanted to focus on getting individuals to that 150-hour requirement, knowing that many students graduate with more than 120 hours today, either because of AP courses they take in high school or just by taking more than 5 or 15 credit hours during a semester during their academic career. So we wanted something that was flexible enough to meet the requirements of those students. Rather than this being an internship, this is a situation where the student becomes an employee of the firm. So they've graduated with a baccalaureate degree. They are hired by a firm, and the firm has agreed to allow them to participate in the program as a staff member. And again, it's not an intern. They would then take the Experience Learn and Earn program where they could take up to 30 hours while working a flexible schedule and getting work experience. And then once they complete that 150 hours, they can continue their journey to licensure. One of the things we talked about early on when we started fleshing out this project was that it'd be a 1-year project. And after reaching out to the major firm group, which is the top 100 firms in the country, as well as the G400, which is the next 400 largest firms in the country, we quickly learned that they did not want a model internship program, and they didn't want something that would require 12 months because they wanted flexibility in the time to make sure that while they had busy periods, their staff had the ability to work those busy periods, but they would allow them to have that extra time to take coursework during their slower periods. So we didn't cap it as at a 1-year period. It's really up to the individual and the firm to decide what semesters they have the ability to take the coursework in. So what's included in the 30 hours? I think this is one of the interesting parts of the program. The individual and the firm have the ability to identify the skills and competencies that will make that employee successful in the firm. It's a mix of traditional coursework and experiential learning. We're hearing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot about experiential learning models right now. And we wanted to stress that this is not an internship program. There are some jurisdictions that follow the Uniform Accountancy Act or have other models that restrict the number of internship hours to 9 hours. So back in October of 2020, the UAA model rules were modified to move it from 6 hours of internship to 9 hours. And that 9 hours is 3 in accounting, 3 in business, and 3 that could count toward the 150 hours. There are a number of a number of jurisdictions now that do not place limitations on internships, but we didn't want to have to worry about the nuances in the various jurisdictions to launch this program. And it's offered in an asynchronous online format. And if you're not familiar with asynchronous, it just means that we could all start the semester on the same day, but it's up to us individually to complete it at our own pace as long as we complete it by the end of the semester. So Martin could complete the coursework in 6 weeks. It might take me 10 weeks to complete the coursework, but at the end of the day, we both are completing the coursework and getting academic credit. And that's the last piece. The credit will appear on a college transcript from accredited college or university. We believe that would meet would really meet every jurisdiction's requirements with respect to acceptability. I've had some questions about it, and there are a couple of jurisdictions looking at this now, but it's really no different than if I went to school and graduated with 133 credits and I needed 17 credits, and I went to another school to get those 17 credits on a transcript. Essentially, a Board of Accountancy would get 2 transcripts from my application, one with my baccalaureate degree and the other with 17 hours through the ELE program. It wouldn't even identify the ELE program, it would just identify the college or university and the academic credit grant. One of the things we learned quite early on when we started the CPA Evolution project, 5 years ago, was the importance of outreach to various constituent groups to solicit their input into what we were doing. Then this slide just shows you we reached out to firms, and the ACPA has done a great job reaching out. As I mentioned, the Mauricio Fern Group, the G400, as well as the Private Company Practice Session, which is the smaller firms in the country. We also reached out to boards of accountancy. We had some discussions at various NASBA meetings and conferences. We reached out to the academics and universities, state societies, and both the board of directors of NASBA and the AICPA. So right now we're launching next month a pilot with Tulane University's School of Professional Advancement. It is not their school of business, and they really have multiple schools within the university system. This allows them the flexibility in their School of Professional Advancement. They actually draw from professors from throughout the college to teach various coursework that's available through their School of Professional Advancement. The tuition cost is $150 per credit hour. As I mentioned, the courses will begin next month. And we're also looking at opening up registration. Registration is currently open for the summer of 2024, and we'll be opening up registration for the fall of 2024 in the coming weeks. Beyond the pilot, we've also worked on a RFP to engage a larger pool of colleges and university based on the principles and the criteria we've established for the program. That RFP has been evaluated, or we provided input from the AICPA's Academic Executive Committee, NASBA's Education Committee, AACSB, AAA's Leadership Section, Education Committee, their council, as well as their board of directors, and also a state society and state board ELE advisory group that we established about a year ago. The intent going forward is to build out additional content and learning tracks for firms and students. We also said if this grows significantly, we have to consider, well, whether we need some sort of third-party administrator for the program. But right now, in the pilot phase, there's no need to do that. With respect to students, it means that this pilot program, students can come from any jurisdiction in the country. Firms have the ability to identify and hire the students that they want. And some firms view that as a way to attract more students. And beyond the pilot, certainly our goal is to increase the number of students every year and potentially, depending on the college or university, introduce rolling admission. So rather than starting on the first day of the semester and completing the course at the end of the semester, you could start during the year, not have those 3 days a year when each semester begins. With respect to firms, we have more than 200 firms that have indicated that they are interested in participating in the program. They view it, as I mentioned, as a recruiting tool to attract students to work in their firms to get that education requirement to get to the 150 hours. And it's tailored learning that benefits both the student and the firm for hopefully a successful career in public accounting. And it's also flexible to firm needs. As I mentioned, we're not tying this specifically to semesters or to a given number of months for a student to complete it. It's not a finite program. So it provides that flexibility that firms may need. And finally, evolving the model going forward, we intend to work with college universities to develop and allow more coursework and build perhaps learning tracks over time that are important. Perhaps it's something like data analytics that's used a lot as an example. One of the other things that's on this slide is expand to B&I, business and industry. What's interesting is that when we first fleshed out this program, we talked about let's focus on firms. And our initial launch date was going to be this past fall in August or September of 23. And having worked through the process and the agreement with Tulane, we decided that it was best to hold off and launch it in January. What that did is give us the opportunity to expand the number of entities that could participate in the program. So we actually have opened it up to business and industry now, in addition to firms. So I mentioned 200 firms, but also we're reaching out to business and industry to see if they have anybody that they'd like to participate in the program as well. And one of the other things we're talking about is perhaps an accounting boot camp in the future that may attract non-traditional candidates to participate and become CPAs. So that's my last slide for the day. I'm going to stop the sharing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have on that program. And then I'll kind of go into NASBA's professional licensure task force. So let's first address any questions you may have about ELE.
Okay. Nancy, you had a question?
No, I don't have a question. I just want to say, I just absolutely love this. I just think it's a great opportunity to remove some of the barriers for students who are coming through a program who just don't see the path. This gets them the option to get them in the firm, working, professionally while completing those additional credits. And I just think that this is a great move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm really excited about this program, and coupled with a recent change to increase internship hours in the state of Oregon that qualify, I think this is could be a powerful tool for pipeline issues everyone's experiencing. So, Martin.
So Dan, I give you a little bit of a warning about this. And first of all, thank you for doing this, and thank you for your faith in me that you expressed during the presentation that I could somehow complete a semester course in 6 weeks while doing this job. So thank you for that. But my question to you, or my serious question to you is, can you talk with us a little bit about kind of scalability and kind of where things really are at now, right? Because I'm you already heard the excitement in the room just now about the program and the potential, right? So of course, the natural place where my head goes next is this really ready for us to say, hey, Oregon firms, here is this opportunity, right? Because what I'm a little bit afraid of is, clearly right now there's one pilot university, the way you've described it, right? So I don't know, are you guys looking for more students? Is this too early for us to really advertise this out to firms? Can you just talk with us practically about where we're at so we can kind of stay in kind of a, common sense alignment so we don't get in each other's way?
Sure. We have the pilot running this spring semester with Tulane University. There's about 30, more than 30 students who are going to participate in the pilot. We've opened up the summer semester as well as we're going to be opening up the fall semester of 2024 for registration in the coming weeks. The numbers, I believe the numbers, the program in its structure is more than capable of handling the number of students that we project will be part of the program in this initial phase. The other thing we would be doing is issuing that RFP either in the spring or summertime to identify other colleges and universities that may want to participate, again, under the criteria that we have established. So if volume continues to grow as we expect it will, then I think there is the bandwidth to accomplish what we need to accomplish moving forward.
Dan, Ray Johnson here. The way this is really designed is, as you said, this is not really an internship as much as it's looking at trying to put college credit for certain courses on a transcript. What's the discussion been about somebody who already has an accounting degree in terms of, are we putting more advanced courses on their transcript, or what are we trying to accomplish, and how are those learning objectives being set up?
Actually, they're not supposed to take any, obviously they're not supposed to take any courses they've already taken in their undergraduate program.
Right.
And they've met the core requirements of the accounting core requirements to take the coursework. There are different courses available through the program. And it's my understanding, based on what we've had discussed with Tulane, is that if there are some foundational courses, say it's an introduction to data analytics that you may not have had in your baccalaureate program, and you want to take it, or maybe you had that, if you meet that criteria, then you could take additional higher level courses, almost like a certificate program, Ray, where you have the foundational course, and now there's going to be additional courses that you'll be able to take to expand your knowledge in that area. So we're hopeful that as we get through this pilot, we'll certainly learn from the program and then build on what that pilot is today.
If we can get some examples out there, I think it would certainly help those in higher ed continue the conversation about what we're trying to accomplish with this program in terms of what the 30 semester hour curriculum looks like or may look like.
Yeah, it's not really a formal curriculum where they're going to take these courses, because there is flexibility built in, but there's a series of courses that they would have the opportunity, working with their firm, to identify as being valuable to them. So it may be soft skills, right? It may be communications type things that, hey, we really want to make sure you can write, or you can present, or whatever that is, work with a team on an engagement. But I hear you, and I think we'll continue to build that out, once we get through this pilot program.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And if I may, so Logan Steele here. I happen to be an academic and unfortunately an administrator as well. at Oregon State University. And we have a pretty well-developed eCampus program. So online courses, asynchronous, just as your proposal. And this relates to the tuition cost of $150. So our eCampus it's highly invested in, highly ranked. I think we're 5th in the nation. And we struggle to get similar learning outcomes for our eCampus students as our in-person students, despite a lot of investment. Our tuition rate is $375 per credit hour. And even at that, like I said, we're struggling to get strong learning outcomes. And so I'm curious about that $150 credit target. Is that intended as a cap, guideline? Is there going to be diversity in pricing available for the cost of tuition?
It is the cost, and that is actually what students will be paying Tulane University to participate in the program. We wanted to make sure that it was cost effective. One of the things we've heard is that education is expensive, and that reaching to the underrepresented population was an important part of what we wanted to do. With respect, and I put my CPA hat on and I say, well, how can a college university do this? And I think what they do is they look at what is the number of widgets they need to reach break even in order to do something like this. And so I assume that, Tulane looked internally and said, what do we need to accomplish this? We have the infrastructure now, just like you do at Oregon State. And you already have the structure and the bandwidth there to do it. What would you need to do to break even in doing these, adding additional students through this program? Again, this is through Tulane's School of Professional Advancement. It's not through their business school, and it's something that they've developed that they developed across different industries to allow individuals to have sort of that executive level learning. In this case, they were just able to adapt it to what we were doing for the pilot.
Okay. Well, as a follow-up, that's a challenging notion for me. The way you can make an eCampus program, asynchronous program, work at that cost level is to remove professor interaction with students and use multiple choice exams. It's difficult for me to see that being something that will work with the university trying to actually put in resources to those classes and give faculty time, give feedback to students. So I'd be concerned that you're, effectively saving the students, $4,000 to $6,000 of tuition costs, but at the same time, greatly reducing their learning outcomes. And I agree with you on the cost imposition being an equity issue. But that might be a question that the firms should be answering to make up for that differential and put in some money here to make it affordable.
Yeah,
So the firms aren't subsidizing that at all?
I'm sorry?
The firms are not subsidizing the tuition at all. It's the students pay, and the firms aren't putting in any skin in that game either from a financial standpoint.
Correct. That doesn't mean that a firm isn't going to tell their employee that they're going to pay for it, but
right, of course.
there is no supplemental cost. It is $150. And I, Logan, I would agree about the learning outcomes, and you're not the first person I've heard that from. It's my understanding that, there is going to be interaction, there is going to be availability, but that's why we're doing a pilot. We want to understand how this process is going to work. It's not a huge pilot of individuals. I think it's a reasonable number to work this through this upcoming semester and see, as you said, are the learning outcomes there? Is there enough interaction either with a professor or a teaching assistant or a graduate student, somebody that the learning objectives are meaningful?
Any other questions, comments? And then I think, was there another kind of just report of the CPA, the chair CPA licensure task force as well?
Yes. So last summer, as Stephanie Saunders, NASBA's current chair, she came in on October 31st. As she was putting together her committees for the current committee year, she decided she wanted to create a task force, and the title is Professional Licensure Task Force. And its charge is to consider new concepts for CPA licensure that may be included in the Uniform Accountancy Act to update the current licensure model. And what you see now with ELE is something that fits within the current model. In the case of the task force, they're looking beyond that. They're looking at not only the ELE model or the experiential learning model. Over the last year, we've talked about some of the other models that exist in other countries. Are there other opportunities to have equivalent pathways to licensure that get us where we need to be as a profession? So she is going to chair. She is chairing the task force. Also on it is Sue Coffey from the AICPA, and Sue is also sitting on their National Pipeline Advisor Group, and that group is about 20 people. Rick Reisig, NASBA's past chair, and I sit on that as well. Nikki Nealon, who is on NASBA's board of directors and is the UA committee chair for NASBA. We have Steve Grice, who's a retired professor from Troy University in Alabama and a former board member in Alabama. Megan Durst, who's an Ohio board member and a practitioner. We also wanted to hear from some of the jurisdictions that have been proposing legislative changes. So we included Bob Cedergren, who's the chair of the Minnesota Society of CPAs, as well as David Noble, who's the chair of the South Carolina Society of CPAs, and they're both practitioners. Boyd Search, who is the State Society CEO in Georgia, and Bill Tracy from Texas. He's the executive director, and he has spent years working on the International Qualifications Board, which deals with the mutual recognition agreements with the foreign entities that we have agreements with. Ken Bishop is serving as an observer. He's NASBA's president CEO, and I'm also participating on that as a liaison. So we had our first meeting in November, just before Thanksgiving, and we're actually going to be meeting again on this coming Monday. We had a face-to-face meeting in Nashville. Really talk through the history of the education requirement, the 150 hours. We talked about those international education models that are out there. We talked about the MRAs a little bit. Talked about the differences in the education models between international and US, because a lot of times individuals, stakeholders, if you will, suggest that the education model that we have is more difficult than it is in a foreign jurisdiction that we have an MRA with. And that's not the case, because while we have a 12-year primary education model, a lot of foreign countries have a 13-year model. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. And unfortunately, a lot of people are confused about that and don't know those differences. We also talked about both ELE and we talked about experiential learning, which a few of the firms have established. And then also talked about some of the limitations that some boards have, such as limiting the number of hours in internships. For example, New Jersey doesn't limit the number of hours, so they could do a 30-hour internship, but New York limits it to 6 or 9 hours. So it'd be like somebody from Washington trying to come to Oregon. How different are you in your requirements, and does that provide a hurdle of sorts for individuals who want to get licensed in a jurisdiction? So we actually rallied around a general concept at the end of the meeting, and we're going to flesh that out a little bit. One of the things, and I mentioned this during the presentation for ELE, we have found the outreach and the feedback from various stakeholder groups to be very, very important. So you are probably going to receive an email sometime next week, the board members as well as Martin as the executive director, to participate in a webinar in early January to talk about what this task force is discussing and where it's going. It's also going to provide an opportunity for Sue Coffey to provide an overview or an update on what their National Pipeline Advisory Group is doing. So I think it's really an opportunity to hear a lot about what's been going on in the last 6 months or so. The National Pipeline Advisory Group is really looking at everything from pre-college through licensure for 1 to 5 years, and what can we do as a profession to enhance all of those different life stages. So I think it's really going to be important. And then the AICPA is actually going to work with us to hold a webinar to focus on them and what they're doing as the National Pipeline Advisory Group, and potentially ask for feedback from board chairs and executive directors later on in January. So a lot of information coming up in the next 6 weeks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the time. Any additional questions, comments from the board? Well, thank you again, Dan. We really appreciate the time this morning. Again, thank you for presenting. That's great information. So
thank you. I appreciate, I always enjoy visiting with you. I wish I could have been there this year. The one thing about the pandemic, I guess, is that the positives of virtual meetings is that if you need me to jump in and explain something to you, I'm a phone call away, more or less. So I appreciate it. You guys are all doing great work. Ray, I'll tip my hat to you. I know you're doing a lot of work too. Have a great day and a great meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you. Perfect. And just to kind of, we're probably going to jump around a bit here again. I see Dr. Ulmer joined us, and I know Ray has joined us as well. So good morning to you both. I think what we'll do next is we're going to keep jumping around on the agenda here, and we'll move to the item we added in new business 8F. So that's the report from our pipeline committee chair, Dr. Elizabeth Ulmer. I think that ties in nicely to the presentation we just heard from Dan Dustin at NASBA. And then Ray, then we'll go to you. But just checking around the room, does anyone need a quick break beforehand, or should we keep moving? All right, we will keep moving.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update on the pipeline committee. We met yesterday and made a tremendous amount of progress, although the caveat is it's tough to schedule this time of year, particularly with academics. And so we had a number of board members missing, committee members missing, including Logan. Sorry, I don't know that the recording has been made available yet. So excuse me, the caveat is that what I'm sharing is what occurred during the meeting, but we have not received feedback from all committee members on this. So just to give you, again, a little bit of a background on this, one of the first things that we worked on yesterday was to come up with a committee objective, just to ensure that we were all on the same page. And we do have a draft of that. So we're still working on a little wordsmithing, but at least among the folks that were there yesterday, there was a great deal of consensus that we were on the right track. So it's a little bit long and wordy, but I'll read it slowly to you all so you can hear where we're going. So the committee's goal is to establish a scholarship stream from surplus Board of Accountancy funds aimed at Oregon college and university students preferably with financial need, who are pursuing higher education and in accounting with the potential aim of professional licensure. So again, I apologize for how long it is. It's in very rough form. The key points on this is really that when the committee is coming at this from the perspective of, if we're trying to utilize these funds to ultimately increase the shortage of CPAs in the state of Oregon, we need to approach this much like any recruiting approach does, looking at it as a funnel. How do we get students in from the very beginning all the way down through the point that they get professional licensure as a CPA? As such, we felt it was really important for these funds to be accessible to start getting students into that pipeline early on. So that was inclusive of community college students. The community college students are also really important because they represent our most diverse group of students and the fastest growing nationally group of students who are pursuing accounting. So we're seeing a lot of growth, particularly among Latinx students. So since so many of those students start at the community colleges and students generally, that's particularly important. Martin, do you want to share a little bit about just briefly your conversation with the governor around the aims of this too?
Sure. So the governor's office, essentially, in my very initial conversation, so we could even have this committee and start doing work with what effectively are external stakeholders, primarily in higher ed, to do the in-depth work. I needed to sit down with the governor's office saying, this is what we're trying to do, and get an initial blessing, because the governor's office really likes knowing before you go out to stakeholder groups what it is that you're up to and what it is that you're discussing. And there were two pieces of feedback here, and I may have very briefly covered this at a prior meeting, but I think it's good to refresh memories now. In essence, I got two messages back from the governor's office. One is they are very much on board with what we're trying to do with respect to that diversion of, essentially funds that the profession has already paid in, and essentially seeing if we can build something on the model that originally was done up in Washington State and the Washington Society. The second message was they really wanted us to make sure that we would be able to do it in such a way that we could demonstrate that there will also be an impact on the pipeline, not just in terms of increasing the size, but also increasing the diversity of the pipeline, right? And so we've been talking a bit in the committee around, what it is that we can actually do in that respect that's measurable data around, those types of impacts. So that's essentially where we're at in the governor's office. I think I would also probably say they did a pretty good job hiding how truly excited they were about this, because I got some feedback through another channel later on that basically made it very clear they are really excited about us exploring this territory. So we have a lot of wind at our backs, but we also have a challenge that Dr. Ulmer and this committee are really helping us with, which is figuring out what is reasonable and attainable for us from a data standpoint to actually, be able to go beyond hot air to actual data to say, here's what the impact is if we do this, right? And that's a bit more of a challenge. And I don't know if you want to add on anything to that, but that's essentially the super high level piece from the governor's office that we're dealing with at the pipeline committee level.
Perfect, Martin. I just didn't want to mischaracterize anything that you had shared with me from your conversation there. So yesterday, as I said, our first objective was to come up with an overall objective for the committee, just to frame our work. And then the other two pieces that we worked on are really iterative. We just kept going back and forth between the two. How do we measure success, and what kind of criteria do we need to think about with these scholarships that could be built into a contract with the granting organization to ensure that we are meeting our measures of success? So the first point that I want to make is there is absolutely no way to measure whether a program like this, whether the injection of scholarships is actually going to increase the absolute number of students, because there's too many other factors going on. As you, for example, just heard, all the changes that are happening with NASBA's recommendations. What we can do, though, is measure whether whether our goals are actually improving the diversity of the pipeline. And that one is actually not too bad to do. And let me start just with what our broad criteria are, and then I'll come back to why those are measurable. So these are broad criteria, and again, these are all in very draft form. But the first thing that we did all agree upon at our very first committee meeting, yesterday was our second, was that financial need should be the criteria that really drives granting of scholarships. Currently, the majority of scholarships are not need-based. They are only performance-based at quite a high level. And so most scholarships are going to specify a GPA. Most often it's an A-, somewhere between an A- and not even down to a B+. So they're always, right in that 3.334 range. That is your most typical, at least in my experience with the Oregon Society of CPAs. That's what we tend to look at. I sat on that committee for many years, and PSU. So by focusing on need-based, that is an imperfect proxy for diversity, for racial diversity, because you do see more need-based among racially diverse, underrepresented minority students, but it also captures economic diversity, which has historically not been great within public accounting. So financial need. We also felt it was very important to expand this scholarship opportunities through this stream to part-time students. Currently, OSCPA, which we expect to be the granting organization, does about 100,000 plus or minus of scholarships a year. And we're looking at a much larger number for ours, but OSCPA is restricted to full-time students. There is tremendous financial need among part-time students because if students drop below 12 quarter credit hours, they no longer are full-time and lose access to federal financial need-based aid. So given what we're seeing a lot in, at least at Portland State, and I think probably Oregon State and University of Oregon are experiencing this to some degree as well, students are desperately trying to work full-time and take 12 credits in accounting, and that's not a recipe for success. And so a lot of those students will burn out faster and say, I've just got to get out of school. I can't make it to the 5th year. So financial need, and I'm not saying absolutely nothing on performance-based, but that financial need will come first, and probably a lower threshold on performance-based GPA. Community college access is also tremendously important, and then these would be open to both degree and non-degree students. Like I said, this is iterative with how we will measure the success of the program. Universities capture data on gender, financial need, race is voluntary, but I know at PSU, the majority of students do report racial data, and they also report whether they are a first-generation college student. PCC does the same. I don't know, Logan, do you all capture all of those metrics?
Yes, identical.
Okay, I wasn't sure about first gen if you guys did. So all of that is available for us to understand what is the population of students within the state. And then we can then look at our applicant pool and see whether we are capturing a more diverse, less diverse, equally diverse population of applicants, and then that can be ultimately compared to the scholarship recipients. So that type of tracking allows us to be able to report at least on that aspect of success of the program. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if there are some questions that I can answer. Like I said, I feel like we've made a lot of progress in 2 meetings, and I'm hopeful that we'll have all of these items really finalized by our next meeting in January. We're meeting monthly, but I would definitely be open to questions or input from anybody on the board or anybody else on the call.
While folks think about questions, I want to take the liberty to add one more piece that's also very much directly in the lane of what I just talked about earlier in the executive director's report on budget development, because there is also a significant subset of work that a subcommittee of the pipeline committee will need to do with our treasurer, particularly over the next 5 months, to kind of come up with the in-depth financial set of proposals for how this is going to work, because we are going to need to build it into our budget, which is going to have to go before the June board meeting. So there's a lot of work that we have to do just on the fiscal side of that equation. And for that, Scott Wright, who's on the committee and is very well known as a former board chair and OSCPA chair, and the person who was really the lead board member leading us through our fee increase process that we ran through back in 2014, 2015, will be key. We also have Mark Miedema, one of our CPAs on that task force, who just retired from Oregon State University, but is a former, really primarily a former DAS staffer and a former budget analyst for the Board of Accountancy, and who's in-depth familiar with the legislative processes and budget building and so on. So those two will be my two primary partners, as well as, depending on item, I think 20 on the agenda, whoever our treasurer is going to be next year. I know Jason, I gave Jason a heads up, but depending on how that officer election comes out, that's the core group that I also need to do a substantial amount of work with just on the fiscal side of that equation, because that needs to align with that process that essentially starts in January and pretty much ends by the end of June. For us to build our process, it all needs to be fully aligned so that it all kind of can come together in one beautiful piece of music that we can sing beginning January 2025 in the legislative session.
Thank you. Martin, I have a question primarily for you. I think just for clarity, can you remind me what's a realistic timeline to see this come to fruition?
If fruition is defined as the first time scholarships could be funded and awarded to a physical student, right? So meaning when is the first time an actual award could be given as part of what we're trying to do here, is if we get this through the 2025 legislature and have everything ready, right? Given that the OSCPA cycle occurs in spring of every year, the earliest we can dramatically impact awards is the spring of 2026.
Okay.
Right? Because the legislation needs to pass, there's certain implementation pieces that would need to occur, right? And then essentially you would move into an implementation phase primarily in the fall of 2025, which then means that on OSCPA side, you will be fully ready to go, with respect to the 2025 cycle.
Okay.
With respect to the 2026 award cycle, sorry.
That's what I thought, and I'm super excited about this. And then you sit there and like,
why can't it be tomorrow?
now? Because this is this is a part of a solution that's going to take years anyway. And so, now we're looking at, almost 3 years out. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, and I already know the answer to this, but like, if the governor's office is so supportive, can't she just make it be?
Let me ask that question.
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And if everybody's supportive,
yeah,
and it's non-controversial, it's like, this makes so much sense. Can't we just do it?
Well, I can't speak for the governor, but what
Can
I
we
will
invite her
do.
here and ask?
I'm sure I can ask, but here's the deal, right? The problem here is, and Angie can back me up on this, is that one thing the governor cannot do is change legislation by fiat. And right now, the legislative structure of the board, I forget the exact citation in the ORS, essentially says that the only thing the board is authorized to spend money on is its own operations. That's the reason we have to go to the legislature. The legislature doesn't have to bless the detail of this program, but the legislature has to open up the part of the statute that, just like with every other regulatory board, says, essentially that the revenues of the board can be spent on the operations of the board. And that's why we have to have legislative action. And I don't know of a way for the governor to essentially act in that legislative capacity. That's still, a province of the legislature. So unless we find a miracle, and with the amazing restrictions that apply to short sessions, right, which are extremely difficult to navigate and manage because you would have to have stuff ready essentially in November, which is in the past, and be one of 2 legislative proposals for any given legislator, or one of only 3 proposals that the governor's office gets. There's almost no way, unless there is an extremely small sliver of potential that you can amend something into a piece of legislation that goes through, right? I can certainly keep an eye on that. I can make that ask, but I am not going to make that promise because I love the enthusiasm. I would love to get this done.
Tell them the ask was from me, so you don't.
Yeah.
Might as well. I figured that was the answer you were going to give me. If there was any way to.
Yeah, I would love it.
Happen sooner. There's a reason I'm not a politician. But any other questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation, and also thank you so much for chairing this committee. It's really important, exciting work. So.
Well, I am thrilled to do this. I believe so deeply in the profession, and the cost of higher education combined with it just skyrocketing living expenses in Oregon is really hammering our students. So this is very exciting, and I thank the board for supporting it. All right, have a great meeting, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, now we'll get back on track. So Ray, you ready? This will be item C, report from the November 9th and December 8th LRC meeting and LRC policy discussions for the board.
Thank you.
I can print you a copy if you'd like.
So we've had a meeting of the LRC last week. And we kind of walked out of that meeting with 2 modest conclusions and 2 big, hairy questions. And I guess I'm going to kind of start by walking you through the big, hairy questions where we need some insight and input from the board. As you know, we've already gone down the path of what a retired CPA can do in a CPA firm. And the discussion at LRC, which I think was confirmed by the discussion of the board and is currently now, as of October 1, residing in Rule, says that a retired CPA in a CPA firm can do anything that a non-licensee can do, and that person work needs to be both supervised and reviewed. And that was a pretty easy conclusion for us to get to, because for the most part in CPA firms, non-licensees are not doing particularly high-level work. We came around to asking the question, because it wasn't answered in Rule, what can a retiree do in industry? And we started with the premise, we started with the CPA firm environment. Can a retiree do anything that a non-licensee can do? And we immediately bumped ourselves up into a wall that said, we have non-licensees who are CFOs, we have non-licensees who are controllers, we have non-licensees doing very significant work, and work that often is not supervised by others and not reviewed by others. And we found that the analogy that we kind of originally built in the public accounting firm environment didn't translate nearly as easily to, when I say industry, I'm going to talk about business, industry, government, not-for-profit, that whole spectrum of firms. So we really felt like we needed to come back to the board and get some thoughts from the board on if a retiree wants to go into industry, to what extent can they do things that we would allow a non-licensee to do? And at the same time, we've bumped up into another question with respect to inactives. And we've got some issues that we're going to be taking to the 2025 legislature with respect to inactives, because we've basically have concluded from our perspective that an inactive, somebody could have an inactive license, work in a public accounting firm in non-client facing work. Work such as HR, work such as IT, and this non-client facing. Well, we've also bumped up into a question, and Angie has pointed out to us that we, in our current rules, say that a licensee who's inactive, we explicitly say in our rules that a licensee who's inactive can work as a CFO or a controller. And that seems to be inconsistent with the underlying the statute. So, you know, we've, and Angie, you may want to step in and talk a little bit more about that particular conclusion, but we've got two different things going here, and they both revolve around the same type of question. If somebody's inactive or if somebody's retired, and that's two very distinctly different classes of individuals. When they move into industry, government, not-for-profit, what's the extent of the work that these individuals should be allowed to do? And that's the thorny question that we'd like to hear some advice and guidance from the board. So I hope I explained that well enough. I'd be happy to amplify on that if you have questions. And we're looking for your advice and wisdom on these two topics.
Questions, comments from anyone? I mean, maybe either Martin or Angie. For me, can you remind me of it feels like we're in a pickle here with what happened with allowing inactive licenses to work in industry right now.
Right, and we shouldn't really even, I mean, I think he's just using that as sort of like an analogy, but like what we're looking at right now is retired, and so that.
I get it,
Yeah.
but why I say that is because notwithstanding that rule, and this is my kind of, I could be persuaded otherwise, is I don't know why they would be allowed to do more in industry versus public as retirees, and it would just be active at that point. If you're going to do things that aren't supervised or, client facing, meaning your employer, that is, to Ray's point, these are big jobs, CFO roles that people are relying upon your professional expertise and judgment. And so, notwithstanding this kind of inconsistency, with even though it's a different classification being inactive, I'd be like, just be active.
Well, it's really interesting to say that, and without trying to weigh in substantively, I just want to remind the board of one factual piece that we know from the underlying data, right? And that is, we do have not extremely specific, but pretty enough telling data that we have at most 200 folks out there that are in inactive status in an industry. And what that means is, if you look at kind of the overall data, right? I can feel like I could look a board member, a legislator in the eye, or the governor's office in the eye, and say, most folks that are in the private sector undertaking these roles that, as you just described, are pretty significant, have already chosen to be actively licensed. There is a minority that has not. Now, it's not a small minority. You know, it's roughly 200 people ain't nothing, right? But you essentially already have, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective, right? The vast majority of those that are doing that work in the private sector are actively licensed, right? But we do have, you know, roughly about 200 that have not gone down that road. And at some point, we're going to have to deal with that one way or the other. And I know that's not directly on the issue of the retireds, but just want to make sure that folks know this is where we are at, just on the number side of the equation, as you weigh in on where you would like to have us go policy-wise.
You know, another question is kind of comes, do we define this in terms of what, I mean, does somebody's work have to be supervised by another? So you're saying a retiree cannot be in the position of supervising other people. Do you say a retiree cannot be in the position of signing reports or, you know, I think, you know, signing audit reports, signing financial statements on behalf of the company, not in a position where they're supervising other people. Is that a way for us to look at this? And again, I welcome your thoughts on, you know, if somebody's retired and we allow them to take compensation, what types of things do we allow them to take compensation for?
My point of view on this might differ from the board consensus. And this is maybe overly simplistic, but you know, I see this as the practice of private accounting. It's not public accounting. They may be, as individuals, former public accountants, but it's difficult for me to justify like reaching into the private firm as a regulator of public accounting and requiring that former licensed people, inactive people have to be active to perform roles that someone who has never been a CPA can do. They're signing off they're signing off financial reports for a private entity. They're not public accountants. And who are we to say what they can do?
Yeah, I struggle with that in maybe a little bit different way, from the standpoint of essentially dictating who private companies can hire into those roles. And that while, yes, we could think that people who go into the role of a CFO, it would be responsible for them to maintain their license. Maybe that's our personal opinion. Maybe that's what we would do personally. But I'm not sure that I think it's our role to say, you private business have found a candidate that you love and you think can do the work, and they have an inactive license or a retired license or a lapsed license or whatever license, and they need to get back in active status for you to be able to hire them. I don't like that.
I agree with what you're saying, Haley, and I don't think that they should be prohibited from working in the industry. Now, sitting in a CFO position myself, you know, the same thing. I'm gonna keep my license active, stamp it on my CPE and all, because it's kind of necessary to fulfill the role, you know, having that knowledge, not the knowledge that goes with it. And in most organizations, the firm, you know, like TriMet pays my CPA license and they pay for my continuing education. So on another hand, it's pretty easy to
Yes.
get inactive status, but I don't think that the person should be prohibited from working, you know, on the business side with an inactive license, as long as they're not holding out as being a CPA.
Yeah, right, of
Because
course.
there's a certain expectation there, you know,
Yeah.
and even if you say, oh, you know, I'm inactive or I'm a retired CPA, all they hear is CPA. That's all they hear. They don't hear the rest of it. And they believe that there's a certain element prohibit them, but there could be encouragement to maintain that active license.
I just realized and picked up on something, Nancy, that you just said, when you said you have the knowledge and you have the license. So are we saying that those are one and the same? That if someone has the knowledge, but their license is lapsed, retired, whatever, but the knowledge hasn't gone away, and so is that business hiring the knowledge? Or are we saying that the knowledge, the CPA certificate comes with that knowledge and has to? Personally, I don't think so, because I believe a business can hire somebody because they have a certain knowledge base that is necessary and wanted to fulfill a certain role, even if that person was a CPA. And it's okay, they got that knowledge because they were a CPA. They were 30, 40 years a CPA, and now it's not going to go away. And so I want to use that knowledge. I want to hire it. This guy's smart. He can fulfill this. And
See,
so,
I agree with you all. I'm just saying that as soon as a person says, I was a CPA, the word was gets dropped. You don't hear anything else. They're a CPA. And I'll give you an example. In my role right now, we're dealing with another outside entity. And on this other entity's board is a gentleman. And I've heard him say, I'm a retired CPA. But the group says, well, but our CPA says this. It's like, no, he's retired and he shouldn't be holding out as a CPA because he is retired. But the fact that he put in there, well, I'm a retired CPA, and when I was in practice, da, 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 da. That group, the only thing they heard is he's a CPA. You know, so it's the holding out piece. I don't care if he's a board member. I don't care if he's a CFO with the knowledge base that he needs to run that organization, but it's the element of the holding out when you're inactive or you're retired. What is the CPA doing? Are they putting CPA retired? And is it in little tiny letters? Because, you know, there's just that element of it, but they should still be able to work. You know, just because you were a CPA once, you should still be able to work, still be able to pay your bills, you know, still be able to be an active individual. If that organization hires someone who doesn't have an active license, that's on them, right? But I just don't think we should stand in the way of people being able to be employed.
It almost feels like the conversation is, and I don't know that we have had explicitly this conversation where it's like, we have these 3 buckets of licensure. And really what we're all saying is that we really only need to have 1 bucket of licensure. You're either active or you're not. And maybe when you go, and I'm probably oversimplifying all of these things. And I understand that the initial purpose of a retired license was to, you know, be able to not have to give up your license if you wanted to do whatever, stop getting CP or something like that. But if you have a license and you are doing things with that license, then it should be active, and you retire and you could go to maybe retired status and you just can't work anymore. You're done working. You've retired your license. You haven't resigned it. You don't have to give it back. You can keep your wall certificate or whatever you want to do, but you can no longer work. Doesn't work either. That doesn't work
Right.
either.
So I,
Like, you know where I'm going with that?
Mike, I agree with what you're saying, what Nancy's saying, right? Not interested in restricting people's ability to earn a living and.
Yeah.
What this feels like to me though is kind of like when we see tax legislation and they call it like the Simplification Act or something, right? It never gets simplified. It only becomes more complex, and that's what I like. That's what really I dislike about the whole conversation, right?
Yeah.
I go back to the definition of practice of public accounting, and both industry and people working in firms fall under that bucket. And then so we sit there and like say, well, except for this and that and this. And then we say CPAs are like, well, what is it? Right. And then we struggle with it. And this is gonna be really hard to regulate, because I know we've talked about that. But I guess we're saying it's worth taking on from a pipeline issue. So I hope it has an impact. I'm not sure how much of it will, to be honest. But it bothers me to say, yeah, we're saying this is public accounting, and then we carve out saying, but not if you're an industry basically doing the exact same work as someone in a firm. And so, because we were all okay, I think, with Ray's initial point of where we landed. We want a retired CPA to be able to work in a firm and do anything a non-licensee could, meaning they're going to be supervised, they're not going to sign off on anything. But like a CFO in industry could be that person. And so as long as I don't want to restrict people's ability to work, but it's just a weird talking out of both sides of our mouth conversation to me. And
So, can I add something?
yeah, and
I think-
I was just thinking out loud.
One of the things that I don't know if I struggle with, but one of the things is like when you think of CPA, there's only one thing that a CPA gets to do that nobody else in this world gets to do, and that's opine on financial statements. You must be a CPA to put that signature down there and opine on financial statements. And I think that sometimes that gets lost. You do not have to be a CPA to do taxes. You can be a licensed tax preparer, a licensed tax consultant. Okay, you can do, you can do this, that, and the thing. It's only one thing out there that we do as a CPA that nobody else gets to do. And I think we should not lose that piece and make sure that, that core element of being a CPA, are we protecting that? It feels like we are, right? They must be licensed in order to sign that opinion letter. But I think sometimes maybe we overreach, and, maybe we should just be careful of that overreach. So we're not limiting people, but we're still protecting the profession.
Let me just add a little perspective, and because I think the definition of what it meant to be in the practice of public accounting was probably broadened somewhat in a post-Enron era, where we saw CPAs in industry playing fast and loose with numbers. So I understand the public protection issue with people who are CPAs, because I think you have an ability, if somebody becomes a bad actor in industry, you certainly have, and they're a CPA, you have the ability to reach out and address that issue of somebody not following professional standards. I do like what I'm hearing around the room in terms of, if somebody's inactive, at the end of the day, if they're in industry, what we're really saying is we don't want them to hold out as inactive, CPA inactive, because what they hear is, what somebody's going to hear is CPA. They don't understand what inactive means. With somebody who's retired, you're basically saying, if you want to go to work in industry, that's one thing, but you might be able to tell your employer, okay, I was a CPA, I'm no longer a CPA, I've retired, but we're asking them not to hold out as a CPA retired. I don't know if that winds up reducing our heartburn a lot, but if somebody says, listen, I'm Ray Johnson, I'm a retired CPA. But if I go to work for you, you know, I'm just Ray Johnson.
And I just want to make sure, and Angie, please correct me if I have this wrong, but my understanding is that if we go down that road of saying, okay, let's be stricter about what they can say about who they are, you know, if they're out in the private sector with something other than an active license, right? My understanding is that if we do that, it does not change that right now, every license type that we have, regardless of whether it's active, retired, or inactive, regardless of whether they have a CPE requirement or not, is still accountable to the professional standards that apply to their work. That actually doesn't change. It doesn't remove you from that responsibility. I just want to make sure we don't lose track of that piece of the equation, because that's essentially the price that you pay by holding on to a license from the board, whether it's inactive or retired, because all of them are subject to Division 30 and the rules in Division 30. I just want to make sure we don't lose track of that. So it's not meant to discourage us of going down that road, but I want to make sure that that's clear, that that is still part of that equation, regardless of what we do on whether they get to still say that they're retired CPA or inactive. They are accountable to the standards.
And Martin, I appreciate your saying that, because I think that is more explicitly in the current draft of the rules. And I think that's very important. And we might think about how in the renewal process, we remind licensees of that.
I have a question regarding retired and inactive. After that process is complete, are they obligated in any way to this board?
After what process is complete?
Yeah, I'm retired. I'm done, and oh, this guy wants to hire me. Is there any obligation besides that scenario that they have to this board? Like, you know, I got to renew my license, I got to get my CP. What do they have to do?
So if we're talking retired as in retired status?
This is in relation to what you just said about them being obligated to those standards.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that they are obligated to do?
Other than those standards, no. And unless they have a CPE requirement
No,
for the inactive status. which-
Retired has to, they have to renew.
Yeah.
They just have to renew.
Report where they're working, keep contact information correct, subject to our
Yeah, if there's a
standards.
If
Well, they
there's a
do still have to
complaint that
tell,
comes-
they still have to tell us where they're working?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
And
sure.
they still have to, you know, respond to board communications. So if there's a complaint that comes in and saying, hey, this retired CPA did really retired status CPA with a license from this board, did terrible things, and they come in front of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah kind of takes them through the process and sends them a formal, 21-day response letter, they are still required to play ball.
So am I understanding that we're still regulating them?
Yes,
Yeah.
Sherry, go ahead.
I think that I'm hearing some confusion. So the difference between retired status to the board and being retired. Like retired, no longer working, not keeping retired status. Is that what you mean? Well,
No, retired license.
right, you're not retired, yes, so you're keeping your license?
Yeah, as retired.
Yeah,
Yes.
as retired, I'm whatever that procedure is, I'm not gonna hold out anymore.
I was
because-
afraid you meant, okay, I decided to retire, I'm not gonna keep up anything anymore.
No, not like I'm gonna go to the other side of the world. and
Okay, that's
I'm
what I was
done right
afraid
here.
of.
No, it's, having that retired license or inactive. I'm understanding that we still regulate that by what we just said here, by the CP, the rules and all that. So what's stopping us from saying, hey, listen, you gotta tell us where you're working and what you're doing?
Nothing. Because a license fundamentally is, and this is, my staff will remember this, right? I took them through kind of essentially a little bit of a basic kind of boot camp of what a license is, right? What does that even mean, right? And license fundamentally is an accountability construct. And every license comes in essentially three forms, right? First accountability construct is, do you meet the standard to get the license in the first place, right? That's the education piece. Second one is, do you maintain the educational standard? That's the CPE piece, right? Third one is, you're now accountable under your license for your conduct. That's essentially the Division 30. And that is true for every license that we issue. It doesn't matter whether it's inactive, retired, or active status. Every license has an accountability mechanism if it's, you know, truly meaningful and a true license. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, because then that leads me to open up the door for us to regulate these individuals who want to do work. We're not going to say you can't work, but if those standards are in place, then I think maybe that's a discussion that should be had, and it's an option to you know, where they're at and what they can do, because we already know what they can and can't do. I mean,
The important thing is that they know what they can.
well, that's, yes.
Yeah.
That's the point I was gonna try to get to, because that was my long way of asking, well, how are we gonna know what they're doing? You
Yeah, I
know?
mean, you get a complaint, like, right, what would happen is you get a complaint that somebody's retired and they're doing this.
Yeah, it would have been incumbent on I was thinking it would be incumbent on that individual to self-report.
I mean, they may,
I'm gonna
but
take a quick bio break. Does anyone else need a 3-minute break?
Yes.
Or we could continue the.
take a quick.
Take a quick break,
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, we're briefly recessing, Ray.
Yeah, 10 minutes, 5 minutes? Okay.
That's perfect. Right.
That's extra money.
Ray, can you hear me okay?
It's particularly on the bill.
My dog's- You're on.
But the bills are so fat, I can't.
I know, right?
I wouldn't notice.
Yeah. I'm just letting you put that in there, unmuted.
All right, am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you're good. Thank you for
right. Thank
allowing
you.
us a quick break.
No worries.
So, yeah, let's keep this discussion going so we can provide some guidance to Ray and the rest of the LRC here.
Can I kind of summarize what I'm hearing?
Yes.
You know, I think a key issue of this, I mean, we've got 3 statuses of license. We've got one status is a fully licensed CPA. When somebody goes inactive, they go inactive because, in many cases, because they step away. And that inactive allows them a route back. And I think what I've heard that we're most comfortable with on the people who are inactive, they're still subject to the rules of professional standards under Division 30. In many respects, we feel an inactive CPA should be able to seek whatever employment that they want. But does the public really understand the difference between inactive CPA and active CPA? And at the end of the day, should they really not move out? With respect to retired, when somebody retires, they're doing no CPE. They relicense with the board. I'm in retired status this last time around. I relicensed with the board. I didn't have to report CPE. I probably didn't do my 80 hours of CPE, but I did some CPE along the way. That doesn't matter. Should I be able to say I'm a CPA retired, doing what I do? And what I do primarily is what I do with the Board of Accountancy and with NASBA. But then the related question, if that person wants to go into industry, government, not-for-profits, should they be able to do no CPE and still say I'm CPA retired? Or should we just say if they go in the industry, government, not-for-profit, that they just don't hold out? In all cases, because it's a license issued by the board, they're still subject to professional standards and still subject to any discipline for untoward conduct by the board. I think the biggest issue I'm hearing is how these people should be allowed to hold out.
Well, and I think also as well is that, I mean, so just so we look back at so the statute for retired, right, is very simple, and it just, we can do what we want with retireds.
Yep.
For inactive, the statute very specifically says, if you are an active licensee, you can say you are a CPA, but you have to put inactive next to so that's in the statute, right, versus in the rule.
Okay.
So that's currently in the statute. The other thing that's in the statute for inactive is that you can only be inactive if you do not perform or offer to perform. So it's very specific, right? It actually lists out things. These are the things, if you are inactive, that you cannot do. And, obviously we've talked about how we're going to, the intent is to hopefully change that language and make it a little bit easier for us to have wiggle room around that. But going back to Joe's point, which is where kind of it always ends up coming back to, is that, the definition of public accountancy for the retired side of it is where we then end up with the hiccups. And so right now, the way that the rule we just changed says, if you're retired, you can do anything that you want in a public accounting firm as long as it's supervised and reviewed. If we want to change that, because it doesn't, kind of support the people that want to not, what an application that does for a retired person being a CFO or working for government, what that means is that if you want to have a retired license, you have to be supervised right now. That's what the rule does. So do we want to change that? I guess is the sort of simpler question. And if we do, what do we want it to say?
What do you recommend, Angie?
I mean, the hard part, right, is that from a regulatory side, it does, like I've always said, it just makes it harder. And that, I don't know how many states even offer a retired one, but I know that the majority of the ones that I've looked at that offer retired do not allow them to practice. And it doesn't mean that you can't practice, can't work, period, right? It just means you can't practice public accountancy. So however that board defines what public accountancy is. So that doesn't mean you can't work at a firm. You still work at a firm as long as you're not practicing public accountancy. You can work for government as long as you're not practicing public accountancy. So I think that's an important sort of distinction to understand. When you say you can't work, it doesn't mean you can't work. It just means, and so whatever that definition of that rule is, is what you look at to see what they can and cannot do. You're not saying they can't work at all.
And I think something where we started this, we were very comfortable in a public accounting firm saying the retired licensee could do something in an accounting firm that a non-licensee could do. That became a very different animal in the private sector because we have non-licensees doing all kinds of things in the private sector. They just aren't CPAs. They don't hold out as CPAs.
So then a lot of this discussion, comes down to the definition of the practice of public accountancy, which I think, Martin, you say many jurisdictions don't define.
Yep, that's true. This is kind of where one of the things that this profession has struggled with for a very, very long time My understanding is that right now, the UAA has entirely backed off from defining public accountancy. And I think that is in part a reflection of is that a lot of states have backed off from trying to define public accountancy. I can't give you an exact number right now, but I would be willing to say with a significant degree of certainty that we are in a minority of states that are holding on to essentially doing the really difficult work of defining what the practice of public accountancy is. Now, at the risk of, this is a little bit hard for me because this dates back to before your time with the board, Angie, and dates back to the time of your predecessor, Susan Bischoff, and strains my memory a little bit because it's about roughly 10, 11 years ago when this discussion occurred. But I remember that there was, the struggle has very historic roots for this board. And there was a foundational discussion over a decade ago about for this exact reason that we're struggling today is, should we or should we not hold on to the practice of public accountancy, right? And at the time, although I cannot remember the exact reasons why, board counsel was very strongly basically saying, if you do away with the definition, it will harm you with respect to ability to do meaningful enforcement in the profession. Now, I don't know, remember the exact reasons why. I don't know if you agree with that, so I don't want to put you on the spot there, but that's kind of what I remember. And that's essentially what made the board at that time stop and basically say, we don't want to give up the definition of the practice of public accountancy. Not saying we can't come to a different conclusion now or say, hey, maybe we want to change the definition rather than give up the definition, right? There's all kinds of pathways for us going forward, but that's essentially what I recall from, a little bit more than a decade ago where this board was at and what happened back then.
It would be, I know that's a dilemma. It would be great if we can nail down that definition, because I think we did, I think putting the term practice or practicing CPA, I'm not a practicing CPA. Yeah, I was a CPA, all they hear is CPA, but if we say I'm not practicing, because I believe that the word practice in just in general in the population means like, when you talk about a lawyer, where's your practice? You mean you are a lawyer, or where you lawyer, where are you doing that work? As the same as, I have a practice. I have a CPA firm. Most people understand that. So, but if I go and say I'm a non-practicing CPA, basically says I'm not doing this anymore. Yeah, I was one. But again, we're back at that dilemma of what does that really mean about the practice?
So Ray, does this feel clearer to you? Do you have enough to go on? It's all right. It feels like we're kind of going around in a circle.
We are, and so if I were going to kind of summarize, I'm still comfortable with where we landed for retired CPAs with respect to public accounting, like in firms. Then we have to decide, do we want to distinguish industry again, which in my opinion, while I'm not against, makes the rules more complicated, makes it harder to regulate. And then the other thing I said, if we can always change it, but if you give something and then people do it, right? So what's to stop a bunch of experienced CPAs from switching to retired in industry now? Because, hey, I don't have CPE anymore. This is great. And then we say, you know what, this isn't working very well, and we change it back. We've created a problem. Kind of like what I view this inactive status being right now. If we were to move away from that, how do those 200 people, how do we fix this? That are following the current rules, but maybe we've shifted in what we would want to do there. I'm okay with all of that. I think I'll be off the board by the time we know the answer. It's, do we want to go down that path, or do we want to say, let's open up a different can of worms, I guess is the two paths I see of opening up the definition of public accounting, practice of public accounting. Those are kind of the two paths I see.
I like the definition right now. I think it's a great definition. I quibble with what a client is. I don't think it's your employer, for sure. I mean, but.
Well, that would, yeah, I mean, radically change the definition, right?
And as a matter of history, I would tell you that my recollection was we added employer as a client in a post Enron era, that we wanted to make it clear that CPAs working for employers had responsibilities. So I think that's kind of how that definition of client came about.
And then, Sherry, any thoughts, insights here? I just want to make sure we're getting any of your opinions
You're
here.
doing a lot of thinking over all of this. The one thing that just hits me at the top of the head is I've been around long enough. Unintended consequences are what worries me. And there's still, let's say I'm not aware of their status, but there's still individuals out there that until this retired change was made, they still didn't realize that they couldn't do it. Like they were working in other things, but not realizing that if they stepped away, that they would be in violation of the board. I'm just worried about unintended consequences. And on the, what's different, today versus, let's just say in 2000, is that you can have that pathway to become a CPA through industry, which you couldn't before. I'm a little bit worried about, it's already a little bit hard, but what would happen if folks just said, I'm just not even gonna follow that pathway because then I'm under the board and you know what I mean? If I ever make any changes, I'm this or that. So I would just say, the board is cautious. I applaud you for really thinking through where all these loopholes are. It's complex, very complex. I'm not giving you a good answer, but I do feel like we're moving the right pathway, but I'm just worried about all of a sudden complicating things too. I don't want to have, what I don't want to have happen or see happen is all of a sudden folks going, oh, and they start shifting categories just to, loop out of things, but on the same point, I kind of wonder how many people are really gonna, do that. So.
First, let's stay with CPA retired for a minute. I think our intent all the way along was that CPA retired meant I'm retired, but in today's environment, people retire and still find ways to work. People still find ways to keep themselves active. Engaged, let's put it that way, right? With me, I've done it through volunteer work with this board, with NASBA. For other people, they find other ways to do it. And I think we're comfortable with where we landed on what a retired CPA can do in a CPA firm. And the question related to that is, because you're doing no CPA, we used to have more stringent rules, and you're going to look at newer rules on CPA retired that basically says you don't have to meet the age requirement of 65. But irrespective, I think we're saying that outside of the environment of the CPA firm, we're really expecting CPAs, if they go to work out there, not to hold out, because when we say CPA retired, we're thinking that people latch on to CPA before they latch on to retired. And am I correct in hearing that we're comfortable in letting a retired person choose where they want to work? But we're concerned about how the message that CPA retired sends, and we'd be more comfortable if they just didn't hold out.
I see nodding heads here, Ray, if you can't see
Yeah.
that, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, Mark, do you have any opinions on this, preferences? I want to make sure we get everybody's thoughts here, so. To move the conversation forward, can speak up if you disagree. I think probably the best path forward then is to move forward, kind of as you stated. I think I'm hesitant a little, you know, Sherry's point about the unintended consequences, but allowing those retired CPAs in industry to hold those positions. I think people do it, and I was just sitting there thinking about, well, why would we have all these different distinctions between public accounting and industry? And I think at the end of the day, as a board, our mission is public protection. And the reality is there's more risk to the public in public accounting and firms than in private industry is what I'm thinking about. And so I was like, that made me feel warm and fuzzy. So I'd be okay with that, but I want to make sure that we're getting everybody's opinions on it and also moving forward on our agenda.
I'm very comfortable with this,
Okay.
quite frankly, super comfortable, because I feel like I can make an argument that if you don't allow them to do this, right, who else is going to? And quite frankly, you would much rather have the ability to have those folks in that position, particularly since they are accountable still to our professional standards, than to say that they can't. I don't know that we would actually be doing the public any favors.
No, we wouldn't be. And that's kind of why I'm okay with it. And in 5 years, if, you know, you can call me up and tell me if we've created a regulatory nightmare.
They'll be cursing your name.
Yes. Angie will. But
I will be commiserating with you for my own retirement.
is everyone okay with that? And Ray, is that direction clear?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And then with respect to inactive, I think let us go back and look at the issue with Angie of the language we currently have that says we explicitly allow an inactive CPA to be a controller or a CFO.
Yeah, I think we kind of solved that problem. Sorry to cut you off, Ray. Did we not, Angie? If now we're pretty consistent between retired and inactive and what they can do in industry. So it kind of.
I mean, we haven't changed any of the inactive rules because we're changing the statute.
Right.
So I think we've got to look at how we may come back with a recommendation on, we're already have concerns about the statute with respect to inactive, and the issue is, do we have additional recommendations on the statute with respect to inactive?
Okay.
Is that it? I've got two other minor things. If am I okay on where we are with inactive?
I think so. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Then the Board of Accounts, and these are two issues that we've reached conclusions on in LRC, and the question is, how fast do we want to act? Because you already have rulemaking in process, and that probably the soonest we're really thinking about implementing could be May or July of next year. One is the 6-year rule, that after 6 years, a license lapses, or after 6 years of lapsed asset, the license expires, and if you want to come back in, you got to start all over. The LRC basically drew a conclusion that if we could define just cause. And because just cause is in the statute, then we can provide a way after that 6-year window for somebody to come back in. And we basically determined that just cause was doing, and have somebody completed 80 hours of CPE in the last 2 years, and the person did 1 year of experience, they've been out, then that would allow them a pathway back without having to go back and resit the exam and redo the 4 E's. And I think we're comfortable with that conclusion in terms of trying to find a pathway back, and it puts somebody in a position that once they pass the CPA exam, they don't have to go back and redo. And we probably don't have too many of these people, so this allows a legitimate pathway back, and they do have to redo a year of experience. We can bring that draft rule to you. And I guess the real question for the board is how fast, would you like to see us work on this? I don't think there are many people affected by it, but the people, it makes a big difference to. So the real question, I think, is how fast do you want us to try and bring something to you, and what timeline?
Any thoughts from anybody, or? And again, we don't think this is going to apply to many people, so this won't have a big impact. So I don't prioritize personally, but any other board members feel differently? Okay, I don't want to open up another can of worms by saying this.
That's fine. We'll put this on a timeline that's probably May to July of next year, with the standard exposure period, and we're looking at May to July of next year for a potential effective date.
Okay.
The other issue related to an 8-year rule, which basically says somebody have to complete their 4 E's: education, exam, experience, and the ethics exam in an 8-year window. If you fall outside that window, you got to start all over again. Again, we've looked at states around us, and virtually no other state asked somebody to start all over again. But we basically said, you've got 4 years from the time you complete the CPA exam to complete your experience and education. And if you've already finished your education before the exam, the 4-year window starts with the exam to complete your experience and the ethics exam. If you don't make that 4-year window, then you have to do 80 hours of CPE to kind of renew the process. And so we'll bring that to you as well. And I would expect, again, probably on the same timeline. So we'll be bringing both those rules proposals to you down the road. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. Any final questions, comments? Not seeing any, Ray, but again, thank you for the commitment and all the time spent with the LRC, and please express our gratitude to that committee as well. I know it's a lot of work.
I will, and thanks for your direction here. I think we're on a good path.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
You hear what I said?
Right.
This on Hawaii.
Sorry, what?
This on Hawaii. Looked like it. Right.
Is he?
Yeah.
He's in Hawaii.
He's still in Hawaii.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Hawaii.
Yeah, in Hawaii. It's like, yeah. Right. Told him it wasn't fair.
All right, well, I feel like we stalled out a little bit, so I'm gonna try to keep pushing here. Is everyone good? So I'll go to 7D, which is the board strategic planning. So if you recall, we tried to have this topic in a work session. Was it the September board meeting or the one before that? I can't recall, but that was another one where we kind of talked in circles, and where we landed was Martin and I would kind of take that offline and then come back to the board for the discussion. So that's happening now. You have that in your materials. I think there's a draft that I approved. That was Martin and I met twice separately to draft this, and Martin did most of the heavy work. So thank you, Martin. I bet you did a really great job. And just so I know, did everyone have a chance to read it? I'll probably not, read it out loud unless you want me to.
I could see if maybe we could ask staff, at least on this thing, to project it out on the screen.
And Martin, I do like that, yeah, these materials were all made publicly available, correct? So,
yes.
So I like that, so people can see what we're doing. Just some thoughts on this one. If you recall, the prior version, while there was nothing wrong with it, it just it didn't say a whole lot, right? It said, here's our core values. And I thought, I was saying those are just kind of givens. Those are basic expectations of the CPA and our board. And so I think we didn't do that again. We went kind of beyond that and said, well, what are we really trying to accomplish? And a lot of it, with our vision statement is something we're truly working on already, but it kind of memorializes, here's what we're trying to do. And the past year and a half, it's been a lot of reactive stuff. We're still in the middle of some of that, updating old rules that are outdated and things, but the vision is to become a proactive regulator. And, of course, public protection is number one, but really being proactive with changes in our profession, partnering with our outside stakeholders, OSCPA, of course, higher ed. And so how can we become a leader in that, and really partnering with our profession and doing that? So I think there's a really good opportunity to do that. And so we've outlined some of these goals. I think there's probably, Martin, maybe you could speak to a couple of them in terms of just the DEI plan, and then the community engagement plan that are really working with the governor's office on that component of it. But those are two pieces. But a lot of these are things we're already working on and aspiring to do. So I think it really just it documents, memorializes where this board is heading. And the other big thing and we talked about wording a lot the last goal, which was become a leader in the national discussion on creating more flexible options to achieve CPA licensure. And I won't read the whole thing, but the keywords are there's becoming leader in that. Right now, I'd say we're, hey, we talk about it. We hear what our other, colleagues in the profession are saying. I think there's growing momentum in revisiting this, and I'm personally in favor of it. But I think as a board, we have to say, how much do we want to be a leader in this or not? I would like us to, at the same time, I know time's limited. How much, are people going to step up, start attending NASBA conferences, actually driving this discussion and making real change on that? So that's the heart. Am I being too ambitious here? Possibly. Or is that something the board really wants to do? I think is one question I had on this strategy.
So as you think about your input here, I want to just try adding on one thing, just purely about process, kind of where we're at today and kind of what I'm hoping to do at the February board meeting, depending on the feedback here, right? So for me as an outcome goal, there's two things. One is, Joe and I need feedback on, hey, are you on board with what's there? Are we missing a goal? Are you disagreeing with a goal, right? So there's that at a fundamental level. then once we're through that piece, right, what I'm hoping to do next is that once we know kind of where is the board really at in response to this rough draft, right, what I'm hoping to get to as part of the discussion is to then come back with a little bit more detail at the next, at the February board meeting that says, okay, now that we've gotten feedback from all of you around, goals and what you would like to see here, then I want to take the next step from an accountability perspective and say, here's an outline of what that actually means implementation wise, right? How do we actually accomplish these goals? What does this actually mean for us? I didn't want to get too far down the road with doing this today, because I think the first thing we really have to do is figure out, is this draft something that adequately captures, number one, what the board has already expressed, but also what you really would like us to be doing in the future? And then I can feel like I have enough backing from the board without getting ahead of the board to say, okay, now I can work on a more detailed piece in terms of, okay, this is what it would actually take for us to implement those pieces and take that next step. So I hope that helps just from a process side as you think about your substantive responses. We're trying to get the document posted on the screen as well. If you'd like it, some of you, I can see you have it on your computers, so that's good. But I want to make sure that we all have a reference.
Maybe while we're doing that, just cover the community outreach plan and DEI plan, which are like governor expectations, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it's incorporated.
Yeah, so this didn't come out of nowhere. So there's a lot of plans behind the scenes that I have to write for accountability reasons or just systemic reasons as an agency, right? We've historically had something called an affirmative action plan, which is now kind of morphed into a combined document with a DEI plan. And essentially, that alone has shifted dramatically over time, because it used to be a very, quite frankly, just process and HR oriented document that's really about hiring practices and how we're doing with our staff and maybe at the board level. And it's now shifted completely, thankfully, through, quite frankly, leadership of multiple governors' offices that have basically recognized this is not a meaningful process, because all we're doing is generating a whole bunch of paperwork for an agency that has, 2 staff, 3 staff, 4 staff, 5 staff, right? And we were started to be able to probably about, it started early on about 6-7 years ago, and it's now really come to full fruition, that governors' offices have really opened the door to us saying, hey, an agency like this that's in a regulatory space for a profession, far more meaningful for us is to actually start talking about how we can impact these types of issues in the profession that we regulate, right? That makes a lot more sense than talking about our own internal staffing structure. Again, with a little bit of that balancing act of, we don't get to control exactly what it does, right? But what are things that we from the regulatory side can do? And so in essence, if I had forced you to read through the 20-25 page plan that we have out there, right? What it really does is capture what we're already doing, which is, hey, how are we trying to influence the pipeline of the profession on the regulatory side? What are potential things that we want to do to engage with the profession better? So there is, quite frankly, from a regulatory perspective, and you will recall this from the professional issues update that we just had at OSCPA, right? We essentially are trying to position us as, hey, we are in partnership with the profession, right? So we are part of this vision is, there's no way for us to really impact this pipeline unless we're actually out there, right? That's the part where community engagement comes in, right? It means if we really want to attract, number one, prevent more complaints from coming in, as opposed to just having a good process when complaints come in, that means we have to do more things on the education side. That means community engagement. In that case, that's about licensees and firms and our practitioners, right? If we're going to talk about things like if we want to impact the pipeline, right? That's about folks that are coming in through the pipeline now and supporting them. That's the rules work that we're doing with the board and with Ray, right? But it also means that we actually, there's this whole piece that I'm hoping the board will be willing to have us enter, which is ultimately it would be fabulous if we could partner with our societies in terms of actually engaging with those folks a lot sooner. And there's a lot that can be done there. I'll just give you one example that's very high aspirational, but it's actually real. And yes, it's from a very well-resourced board. But one of the things that absolutely blew me away is finding out that our friends down south at the California Board of Accountancy actually built an infrastructure where candidates can go for transcript analysis, for essentially exam advice, and essentially have a whole infrastructure that's on a volunteer basis that people can tap into that are trying to make it through the pipeline, right? That blew me away, that there is a board that's actually already engaged at that level of depth in that profession, right? So when we're talking about community engagement, I don't just want the board to think about this as some fancy term or going to a meeting or two. We're talking about, what I'm saying is that what I would love for the board to talk about is, are you on board with us essentially becoming a lot more proactive and a lot more out there in the community itself, both for pipeline reasons as well as, quite frankly, from the regulatory perspective of making sure that people understand us better, understand what a relationship with a licensing board is, understand what a license is. And I could see a whole bunch of partnership opportunities with things that happen on the society side that are outside our purview, but where we may want to tap at the same time into the same population, right? So that's essentially what you have on here, is at a super high level, basically saying, I would love to find a way to integrate what the strategic plan for that you're comfortable with for this agency, and essentially support it through community outreach and have that also reflected in our DEI plan. And the governor's office, quite frankly, expects us, there's now a governor's office expectation that we actually integrate all that into a strategic plan. All state agencies have been asked to do that integration, right? So it's not coincidental that you have all these things mentioned up there. But I think the reality is we're already on a logical pathway there already, because we've started the conversation years ago about how this work really integrates with us and how the strategic vision that you've already pretty much defined actually overlaps and integrates in many ways. It's really just an issue of, number one, putting it on paper, and number two, making sure that, and this is probably the harder part of the conversation, is how far is the board comfortable going with actually resourcing that particular activity? Because right now, it's all essentially voluntary stuff that's not, you won't find in a particular position description, right? Which gets to the piece that's at the, I think somewhere in here, I think, yes, it's in there in one of the goals in here, which is, that's the reason why there is also a, very direct conversation here that we're asking for, which is, hey, we're going to have to actually, if you are on board with this, we would actually need to resource it, right? And that would not just potentially help us get there, it would also tie into a separate conversation, which is really about succession planning for the agency and kind of giving us some stability, because we've really struggled historically with being part of those agencies that do not have more than one management position. And so we could actually tackle two things with one piece here, right? One is, if you're willing to resource this, it would also open us up to a much more stable solution as an agency, where every time the position that I'm in turns over, it becomes a significant problem for the board trying to figure out where is the likely place to recruit for this position, because there is no good internal pathway
Yeah.
right now to this.
Martin and I have talked about this several times, and so like I'm excited by this. I think it's ambitious, and again, we've already been ambitious. But as we've been understaffed the past year and a half, we've gotten to full staffing, and when I look at this and kind of say, we're still understaffed to do all this. And so part, to Martin's point is, it's not fair to ask this team, which is a great team, to do all of that on top of kind of a specific job description. And so I think, a deputy director position makes a ton of sense to take some of that pressure off, but to really actually accomplish these goals and this vision. So that would be a really important part of all of this.
Do you need us to vote on that? Or is it?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've been selling it for the past 10 minutes. So,
Yeah.
Can we just decide to add a person?
We can make a.
No.
You have to ask for it.
Okay.
The issue is,
right.
I would not feel comfortable putting it, developing, it has to be done as part of the board's budget.
Yeah, okay, right.
I wish
I don't
we could
wanna
make
go
it
through that
so.
process.
Wouldn't that be nice?
If the board isn't on top of it, the board is not supportive.
It's not hired somebody.
Yeah. I was like,
I
so
would've-
I was thinking, did we have a head count, like a slot that we hadn't identified what we wanted to do with that head count yet? And was this how we wanted to do with the head count, or we need to request an additional head count?
I think
Never
we
mind.
utilized all of the positions. We need to ask for a new.
So right now,
We've already maxed out.
FTE agency,
Correct.
seven full-time positions.
And we're gonna go up to 8.0 if we go forward with this, correct?
That is certainly in the short term, where this would go, right?
Okay.
The much more open question, I'm just gonna be super honest about this, and I know it's a public meeting and that's a little bit awkward, right? On not a short term, but a medium term basis, the biggest unknown that we have from a staffing perspective is, setting this discussion completely aside, completely different topic, is you already know that we have an enormous amount of backlog and work to do in terms of improving our internal operations, right? Because we have such disconnected manual processes, not the type of customer service we really should have, right? So one of the things that, quite frankly, I'm hoping to have a discussion on at the February board, also connected to the budget, if necessary, right, is we have a lot of work to do to figure out what exactly is the pathway for us to get to a better place operationally. And the biggest unknown that I have are two things. One, is there or is there not, and I really don't know the answer yet, is there or is there not a need for an IT level investment to help us get to a better place? Or can we do what we need to do internally without any investments? Asks that I would need to ask the board to build into the budget process. Connected to that piece is the answer to the other question around staffing, right? Because if we do really, really well with becoming more efficient with resources, I am not convinced that we necessarily have to continue, for example, having a front office position. Right, that we could actually do it with our licensing staff as we're dealing with it. Because if we have a lot less paper to process, a lot more ability for licensees to actually do this stuff, I don't know that I could look at the board and I saying 5 years from now, we will still need that position. Right, so that's why I'm hesitating a little bit on saying it's just, right now, this deputy thing is an add-on, but I'm always looking for efficiencies, and I'm don't want to exclude the possibility that we might end up back in a place of right. And that's one of the real challenges that I have kind of going forward, because I'm not wired in a way of that the only thing I can think about are additions.
So Angie, do we need to?
Well, so yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, if this is, you know, the strategic plan that you want to adopt, then we should vote on it.
Yeah.
But if you think it's still in draft form and it needs more wiggle stuff in it, then.
I have a question.
Yeah.
About it. The last goal that you mentioned there, Joe, can you define arena of substantial equivalency regarding the national accomplishments?
So we're talking about pathways to licensure, and right now the primary discussion is, you know, are we stuck with, you know, the 150+1, or can we help lead the conversation at a national level? And there's a couple ways we do this, of saying, are there other pathways that we don't believe are lowering standards, right? So going back to the 120+, I say going back to the 120+2, but I think most of our profession values the 2 years of experience more than the 30 filler credits, right? And I think that's, I mean, when you listen to our peers in the profession, what people want, and I think would that probably single-handedly solve more pipeline issues? I believe so personally, right? And so that was why I pushed for becoming a leader here, because I'm in favor of just doing a full send, you know, and that could happen, one, like we're gonna get really active with NASBA, or we say as a state board, we're going to adopt this and say Oregon's putting themselves out there.
Yeah.
Right. And I like it. I'm in if you guys want to.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean by it very specifically.
Yeah. I'm actually super grateful that you brought this up, because it reminds me that I would have been really remiss not disclosing something else to the board. And it actually works out super great today, because we had Dan Dustin on earlier, who already provided some of the context for what I was about to say, right? This is about the second part of his report around the professional licensure task force that's currently being run under the auspices of the NASBA chair, right? So Joe knows what I'm about to say, right? I essentially said to Joe, this is such a unique time in the profession right now. And I was quite frankly aching at, you know, the tension that we have felt at multiple board meetings. We have felt it at multiple NASBA meetings around, on the one hand side, this environment of, at the national level, of let's not talk about anything other than 150+1 that kind of pervaded us for a long time, right? If you connect that for a moment to the Oregon specific environment, right? The primary direction that came out of the September 2022 board meeting, when we had our first reset after I came on board, was let's do what we can to fix our stuff internally, but let's not break any China, essentially, with NASBA, right? Let's align, but let's not be the ones dancing out of line, right? And I feel like there's a little bit inside this topic. There are two things that are on my radar. One is, I can kind of sense, but it's important for us to talk about it as a board, that we probably have reached that line right now where we feel really good about the work that we have already done to align with others. And this is a part of this for me that I'm listening for in the responses from all of you is the board ready to go one step further and saying, okay, we're not just comfortable with aligning with others, but to start pushing a little bit around pieces and be a little bit more out there, not breaking China, but kind of taking that next step of, are you good with us getting on the radar and saying, hey, we feel comfortable saying that we really want to push for some alternatives and be more public about it, right? So that's one piece. The second piece is about, I don't know, 7-8 weeks ago, I sent a document to Joe and basically said, are you good with me going straight into the NASBA process with this piece? Because essentially it's a document that I wrote up that was attempted to directly address the fundamental struggle that you just talked about in the second part of this equation, right? The struggle with at the national level, we're really terrified of discussing anything other than 150+1 because they're terrified of messing with the substantial equivalency and mobility framework that this profession took 20 years to accomplish, which is an amazing accomplishment we don't want to mess with. So what I ended up doing is write up a document that at the headline had all the disclaimers. Saying, this is not an Oregon board position. This is only my own personal opinion, and so on. It has no endorsement from anybody, and essentially wrote out a conceptual proposal of one flexible pathway of how to amend the Uniform Accountancy Act to allow for additional flexibility in how you could get to substantial equivalence pathways in licensure, right? Without undermining substantial equivalency and mobility, right? And a lot of that work on the substance on the inside was actually built on the very things Dan Dustin talked about this morning, right? Because the profession already knows and has already done the work in the international arena through the MRA constructs. We already know as a profession how to analyze very different pathways toward licensure and how to analyze them in terms of what is substantially equivalent to our current 150+1 standard. And in fact, every jurisdiction, and I think almost every jurisdiction uses the MRA process, what we call the mutual recognition agreement process, which is nothing other than a process run via NASPA, recognized by the jurisdictions, that says we will take candidates from these certain jurisdictions, right? And for that, and these are very, very complex agreements that, you know, essentially specifically analyze the particular education pathway to a particular type of license or credential in that MRA country, right? And essentially say, this is what you need to build on top, if anything, to be equivalent to 150+1. We already have this knowledge. We've deployed this knowledge for over 20 years, right? And the issue is, since we have that knowledge already, are we willing to bring that work essentially into the US, not just outside the US, right? And reading between the lines of what Dan told us this morning is they're starting to open the door to have that conversation, right? About how can we do this, right? My goal was, especially because there's so much perception at the NASBA level that executive directors like me are, you know, a group of resistant people that hate change and don't ever support anything changing, right? There's a lot of tension there, and quite frankly, there's a lot more tension this year because a lot of the really good things that were rolled out very poorly process-wise that really damaged the relationship between NASBA and a lot of my counterparts, right? So I wanted to set a countertone. And Joe, to his credit, gave me the blessing saying, you know what? It doesn't say that the board supports this. It doesn't say this is a formal position. It just says, here's an idea that Martin has that you can throw into the process. Wherever it goes, it goes. Now, if you go back to Dan's presentation this morning, he actually walked you through who was on that task force. You may recall that the last name that he mentioned was from Texas. This is the gentleman who runs the Texas Board of Accountancy, one of the largest boards, and I might also add, given our earlier discussion, the Enron Survivor Board. And basically, I contacted him and essentially said, hey, I know your task force is starting to meet. You're the only executive director representatives. I'm going to send this to you. It doesn't have the endorsement of anybody. It doesn't have the endorsement of the executive directors committee. I did send it out to the executive directors committee. Some folks liked it, some didn't, which is pretty much what I expected. And essentially say, if you're willing to reference this or use this, if it helps you in your work, bless you. And he and I actually talked at length before that first task force committee meeting, and I do believe it had an impact. to a certain extent. So we'll see how much once we find out, because clearly Dan just hinted that there's stuff that's going to come out shortly in terms of where they're going. So I'm super curious if any of that stuff actually shows up. But it basically means I try to do what I could do on my own without board blessing to kind of start impacting the discussion a little bit in terms of at least putting in a productive idea of how the profession can get to a better place around this stuff. But the issue for us here is, are we comfortable kind of going out more formally as a board and saying we want to engage more, not just align more, but start pushing a little bit more, right? And that's really what the fundamental question is.
Several comments when you're.
Yeah, just go ahead. I don't want to keep moving and get people's feedback.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I think about in that there's sort of two options, right? Do we want to help direct the charge of the entire country by engaging more with NASBA? Or do we want to say, we don't really care about the rest of you. We're going to do what we think is best for our state. And if y'all want to follow along, come and check in with us. Because what I'm finding with NASBA is that they're, and it's not NASBA. As we know, NASBA is just the organization that is representative. It's clearly the board of directors at NASBA, which I don't want to be on, but many of y'all might, is they're resistant to this change. They're resistant to making this change. This ELE program is exactly what we're already doing with community colleges. I can send my workers to Lane Community College for almost the same price and get them this random coursework or whatever they need, and off we go. So it's like, good job, NASBA. Like, you did nothing, in my opinion, about that. And now we're going to send them to Tulane for their $150 credit hour. Well, I can send them to Lane for $165 equivalent, I did the math, and get them into underwater basket weaving there so that they can improve their skills in serving our clients that do underwater basket weaving. So I can make an argument for that. So that's a soapbox moment. But so like, as far as not breaking the China at this point, I'm like, break the China. What happens if we go to 150 plus 1? Well, people can still come to our state. Our licensees can't leave. They don't want to anyway, but people can come here. So I feel like from like a what's best for our state and our public and our licensees is for us to be like, well, we're going to do something different. And what we're going to do is be less restrictive than all the other states in the country. And yeah, we mess with substantial equivalency, but we don't mess with it coming here. Right? I mean, like our licensees will struggle to go move to California and get reciprocity there and move to wherever, but like they can still get the credit coursework or whatever they need to do if they feel like I'm going to get licensed in Oregon and move on. But if somebody wants to come from Nebraska and come here, they can get licensed here. So I'm frustrated by, in September of 22, the conversation we had was very directed towards, we have some strong opinions about the direction we need to go. And the movement on the national level is colossally slow. And the movement within our own state process is of course slow. I mean, it just is. So like, the longer we wait for NASBA to bless the whole thing is we're looking at 2030 before any changes are being made. So, I mean, I'm sort of at the point where it's like, sorry, guys.
Break China. Yeah. So that's.
Break China.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's where I'm at.
I know.
Because it takes, if it wasn't obvious. There were maybe more.
But it's also where I'm at, for the record.
I think setting the example will, and that's what I mean, leading, right? It's when you say, hey, Oregon did this, that makes so much sense. Let's do that too. I think other states would follow. Right. So, and the one other thing I would say is, yes, there's an alternative pathway. Other states are reciprocal. People know if they're coming here, taking that alternative pathway, it might not be the other way around, right? So they have to go in eyes wide open know that, but yeah, Jason.
I think we can do both. I do agree with all that you said. I think we can do both. I think we
We
can
can
be
do
a
it less aggressively, is that what you're saying?
well, we can step out there and be a front runner for it. We can also be a part of NASBA and everything.
For sure, yes.
And definitely we need to be more in that group and have a voice in there. And us stepping forward and doing it first is just gonna lend to us having a voice. But no, I agree. Goals shouldn't be something that you can just step across the line and say, I'm at the goal. It should be something you have to actually reach for. So I agree.
You're
with that.
exactly right on the NASBA front. That's like, we can do what we think is best for our state. It might be in conflict with what NASBA's official position is, and we can still engage, and we should engage with NASBA to be like, okay, we are in conflict, and here's the reasons why we think this is best for us.
I'm in total agreement with doing both.
Mhm.
And with that, breaking the China. Thank you. Let's let them break the China. We're just, like you're saying, we are doing the best for our state. This is what we're doing. You're welcome to be here. We're in this group at the same time, but we're not really causing havoc. We're not forcing it on them, right? We're not telling them this is the way you should do it, but this is the way we think it should be done, and we're gonna do it because we can and we think it's right. And if you don't like it, then let them rattle their cages and throw in the dishes and see where they land. Because what I'm, in essence, I said, just let them deal with it. Just let them deal with what we're doing.
Martin, are you panicking? Okay.
I'm not panicking. I think that there's.
There was one look on your face.
No, I'm processing. So I don't want to speak up on where the board should go, but here's what I will tell you. I feel very comfortable with becoming a lot more aggressive because we actually have a number of things on our side right now. One, we have a super excellent relationship with the society, and I'm not hearing anything here in this room that suggests we should abandon that pathway. Because especially if we're going to step out a little bit and become a little bit more Oregon focused, we need to make sure that that's done, in a way that where we're internally inside Oregon, we have our stuff aligned. Second, there is a small chance that what you said, Haley, might turn out to be wrong in one respect, in a blissful way, right? Because we're absolutely right, especially looking backwards, right, in terms of where NASBA has been, right? My sense is that we might actually be in this panic moment right now, right, where both AICPA and NASBA are realizing they can't hold on to this wall of it's only 150 plus 1. So I'm actually really wondering whether we're now going to see the opposite, where you have like the stuff actually swinging back, and now they're going to be on fire about doing something different about that 150 plus 1. I don't know yet. We'll find out shortly. We'll know by the next board meeting, right?
What do you think? Do you have any sense? I don't know how you would have any sense. We don't know who it is, but do you think that Ken Bishop's retirement will play into this at all? I mean, I think Ken is very much a steward of what their board wants, but I'm wondering if that's going to make any.
I don't think so. I don't mean that negatively toward Ken or anybody.
No.
I just don't think that particular dynamic
Is that
matters for that particular issue. It matters on a whole bunch of other ways,
Sure.
but not for that issue. What we have got going for us is that if the board's willing to embrace a more, yes, engage with NASBA, but also more aggressive, this is what we need to do for Oregon, right? We have another few more months, number one, to figure out, is there a legislative ask we want to make? Because quite frankly, if you're going to move away from 150 plus 1, that means a legislative ask.
Yep.
Just be really clear about that, right? What is on our side in that respect is the pre-existing relationship with the society and knowing that we should know a lot about where NASBA is heading as we are developing this. So we will have, I think, actually multiple shots at the apple of calibrating, right? Do we really need to break the China? Or is this actually, do we get lucky that there's actually enough movement at the national level that actually works for us here? I don't know the answer to that, but things are moving a lot. And I think that's very much in favor for us here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on the outcome of this discussion, we should move full steam ahead with the legislative ask, it's my opinion. But to move this forward, because I mean, that's just one piece of this. And so is there any other board members that want to comment on it? I mean, Nancy, do you have questions, comments? And then Sherry, I wanted to get your thoughts on it too, just because this is a partnership and we want to make sure any concerns here?
Do you mind committing your board?
Yeah. Did that scare the crap out of you? Cite
You want your personal opinion.
It did, and that's.
Sorry, being recorded again.
Okay, it's my turn.
Yes.
CPA, I think Dan referenced it, MPAG, so National Pipeline Group, made up of a number of CPA society execs. Also, NASPA's been in that mix, stakeholders in that mix. I'm just being very blunt and factual. Minnesota opened up the door for conversation. By Minnesota opening up the door, that conversation is occurring elsewhere. In my opinion, AICPA and NASPA both cannot ignore that conversation any longer, hence the creation of MPAG, and hence the discussion. We heard the reference from Dan today. We would not, in my opinion, we would not have heard any of those conversations publicly before Minnesota. It's factual, it's out there. Before CEO Group, some years back, 2018, I guess, and said the elephant's in the middle of the room. I've had an email from a member, from a partner, about 150, and they have someone that cannot get licensed because they're not going to go back to school for the 30 hours. Got to talk about this. It didn't go any further, but as I said, I work for members. So I would just say, Dan was right. I mean, there is I think it was Dan that said it. Anyway, there's conversation like Haley, what you're saying doesn't surprise me at all. We've had members for years expressing concerns. Some express support for it. So it's not everybody expressing concern. Some are very silent. I can't commit my board. I don't. One of the things that we talked about, if you were to talk with the board members, Gary Rader, we were not feeling like we could step up and take the Minnesota path ourselves because of our size and our resources. Minnesota is very large. You have larger societies than that, but the activities are already occurring around the country. I think hence why you have AICPA and NASPA discussing these things. It wouldn't have been a topic not that long ago. So I don't know if I'm really helping you.
I mean, Minnesota was in the back of my mind with all of this. And we wouldn't be the first state, but having another state step forward and saying this needs to change, I think is going to help create momentum and maybe there's, it'll happen at the national stage while we're doing it, but.
Rumors run rampant, Joe. I mean, if you're listening to any rumors, you gotta believe that the conversation is occurring in another jurisdiction of the state.
Yeah.
And you actually had a hint of that earlier today,
Yes.
right? There's a reason why he specifically mentioned a South Carolina member on that task force, right? It's because South Carolina is about to pull the trigger on the same thing, right? Which is ultimately going to force this question of how are other jurisdictions going to react? Because, and then Angie, this is one part that at some point, and maybe this is a conversation we can have in a little bit more depth so that I don't put you quite on the spot quite as much in February, right? But I think it will be good for us as this discussion develops forward to reground the board in terms of what the mechanics of substantial equivalency really are. And probably the hardest thing, both legally and politically, is it's such a super hot topic is who actually decides what substantial equivalency is, right? And this is actually where really things get really interesting, right? Because we use a NASPA framework, but the reality is we have a constitutional structure in this country. That means regulation takes place at the level of the states. It is not dictated by NASPA. And the simple truth of the matter is every regulatory state has to make its own decision as to what happens when another state moves away from the 150+1, right? It's ultimately a decision that has to be made by each jurisdiction as to what they then still consider substantially equivalent. NASPA can't directly force this, right? They can have a lot of influence, they can send lobbyists, they can put pressure on, but the simple truth is every single state board of accountancy ultimately will have to make very difficult decisions, whether it's Minnesota or South Carolina or Oregon, right? What it is we're going to do once the dam breaks and you have one jurisdiction that says we're going to do something other in addition to 150+1, right? Anyway, I'll stop there because I want to make sure we don't lose focus on the state, on the strategic plan piece.
Yeah.
We'll need to circle back on the legislative piece.
Agreed, but I think that's assuming if this is approved.
Yeah.
I think a very high, if not our highest priority for the legislative council.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand a little bit more about the bullet points.
Yes.
Right, but I don't want to sideline the strategic discussion.
Okay, and but I mean, I think we've gone through them, right? Is anyone have a potential edit, a concern, a revision? Not seeing any, so then would there be a motion then to approve the strategic plan as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Have a second, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none. Abstentions? Hearing none, okay, motion passes. So that's great.
Okay.
You look a little bit not happy, but.
No, I'm super happy.
That's his face today. Not happy more.
Just while we're on it, so that we don't lose it, and in the interest of efficiency, since I'm now under a January 2022 deadline as of yesterday to essentially outline what are our goals for the 2025 session with the governor's office. And given the discussion that we just had, what I'd like to do is run through a very high level outline of what I think I just heard in terms of the substance of what we're proposing, because I want to make absolutely sure that we are all level set on that, okay? What I would envision is, it doesn't mean throwing out what we have right now. This is all about options, right? So if somebody wants to go through a 150+1 pathway, let them. If somebody prefers a 120+2 years of experience pathway, let them, right? So it's about opening the door rather than saying you no longer need, it's like pick whatever works better for you, right? Because you may have post-bac people that already have a ton of hours and come to accountancy late that may prefer to do the 150+1 rather than the 120+2, right? I prefer options. I want to make sure that that's cool with folks, and that in essence, what we're talking about is allowing, number one, this additional pathway of the 120+2, which is what we had before 150+1 came into place, right? And then I don't know yet, but what I'm assuming is that I have to look at the substantial equivalency wording in our statute, and I will have to do a little bit of work with you before the February board, right? Because what I'd like to do is incorporate in it some really clear language in terms of how we define substantial equivalency, and essentially in the process, send a very clear signal that we will determine substantial equivalence in any other way, that we don't have to go back to the legislature if another state goes to 120 plus 2, that we will already have the authority to bring people in here and accept those, that essentially if another state does the same thing, that we have the ability to say, you can get licensed here, right? So it's not just about us and our folks, but are we open to essentially say, if another state goes down 120 plus 2, that it doesn't become a hurdle for, you know, our board staff in the room to say, we can take that person through our licensing process on the reciprocity side.
I think that's spot on.
Are we good with that? Okay. I'll wait for a moment before debriefing Dustin about this meeting.
Feel free to withhold my comments about the ELE.
I have it on tape, don't worry.
You can listen if you want.
I think we just finished 7. As far as it's almost noon, should we try to get through 8 and then grab lunch and keep working? Or Martin, what do you think there?
That's really up to you. I'm so 8, I think it's all business items. Which
We're all
are
gonna
relatively-
talk less now, I think, right?
Yeah, a lot less.
We're hungry, so yeah.
I get the directive.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna push a little further than, assuming lunch is here, then we'll grab lunch. All right, and then just looking at you, Angie, we didn't scare the crap out either.
No.
Okay. Okay. Okay, board terms and appointments update.
Okay, so just very briefly, this is a bit my fail. I did a little bit of a run at the roster, and of course, we've all known about, you know, Nancy, and this will come up later, of course, in terms of celebration of her service, but we knew that Nancy's term was up and she was dropping off, but I also realized, hey, wait a minute, we have other board members too, and they all have terms too. So they're actually doing a little bit of a the update is we have Haley and Jason, whose term is up, and actually Raul's, whose term was up actually a few months ago already, where I was like, oh my God, okay. So we have to do the, we have to do a little bit of work of either reapplying or, you know, finding even more folks. So there's a little bit of that we have to discuss. I do also want to say publicly, thank you to Sherry. Sherry and I have been doing a lot of work with one of our LRC members, Megan Hartley, to kind of support her through the process of putting in an application with the governor's office. She's at Deloitte, so she has to go through pretty intense. And I feel comfortable saying it publicly because we've publicly discussed it. OSCPA has publicly discussed it and has her nomination supported, quite frankly, for years already. So we're hoping to get at least one person already in the door that specifically was intended to come in after you, especially because she has a audit and assurance background, which will be really, really helpful if you can get that with your departure. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I don't know, Jason, if you want to take it from here since you sent me a little email.
No, I reapplied, so.
Jason reapplied.
Not reapply. And I'm not going to.
Actually, the last comments, yes.
Then I said I didn't respond to that because when I said be a leader, I was picturing Haley in my mind and all this stuff, but.
I guess I'll reel it back in.
We're still doing it, right?
Well,
We're still doing it. We'll make you proud.
I know you will. It's.
I will miss you a
Family
ton, but-
obligations have intensified. I thought it would be easier when my kids entered school. School days, they don't get to go. We're like daycare, they can go all the time. And I didn't anticipate that, so there's just a few.
Different kind of busy.
It's a different kind of busy. So. Yeah, that's what I'm learning, so that means it's time to start saying no.
No, I wanted to also just say thank you for agreeing to still be here in February, because it's gonna take us a while to kind of get back up to speed and, with that process, so.
Yes, that's, those are big shoes to fill, and so we need to also know what kind of cake or whatever.
Yes. It's true. And there's a high standard to meet, as you will find out later when it comes to cake. So what that means is I'm gonna need some help from folks, especially if you have particular recommendations of folks that I should approach around board membership, because it will be good if we can kind of fill in the have the governor's office choose for more than one person. They don't typically like very much being in a position of, here's the person we have for you. They usually like to have choices. So it would be really good if you have stuff, please bring it to me. I'm meeting with the governor's office on Tuesday regarding our appointment scenarios.
So yeah, outside of our last subject, which I said might be our top priority, this one probably in the very short term is because having a full board where we get everybody's different perspectives and expertise is pretty critical. So we have to make that happen. And Megan should be February, we're hoping.
Sorry, what?
She should be February, online February, hopefully, for the board.
Megan?
Partly?
No.
Oh.
I
So
don't
it's
think it
harder
will do
to
that. And I
get a legislative concept passed than get it through Deloitte. I know this is being recorded, just a little dig. We need her. Just all in fun.
So that's all I have on that. That's all I have on that front. Okay. If you want to make you super happy, I can do B and C in one sentence.
Please do.
We have fixes because we did so much work on rules that we have now uncovered partially on our own, partially Angie's help, little problems that have slipped in when we did our rule filings, right? Probably the most embarrassing one is that we figured out a bit late that something misfired in the last filing with the Secretary of State's office. And there was a section of our rules, beautifully written, beautifully approved by the LRC, beautifully approved by the board, that somehow got cut off in the filings process and we didn't realize it. So we're gonna have to do a temporal to fix that stuff. I don't need board authority, I just wanna be transparent.
It's a run-on sentence, Mark.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was more than one sentence. But
We have fixes.
We got fixes.
And probably the most embarrassing one is that Ray also feels quite a bit of chagrin about is we failed to put in a rules fix for the fact that we're becoming a 120 to sit state on January 1. The good news is statute rules. So the rules fix is essentially a behind the scenes thing, right? Because the statute requires that we become a 120 to sit state, but we actually have to do a rules piece. So stay tuned on that. That's B and C in more than one sentence.
Okay. We want to cover 8D real quick, and then we might need to do old business after executives, or is that?
We just have two. We also have the wall certificate.
Oh, yeah, we do have E and F that have been added.
Yeah, the F we already have, because that was Dr. Alma's report. The examination data, that is simply for your information. I just throw that in there.
Yeah.
When the board has that. I'm not a super big expert on this stuff, but I always feel like in the interest of transparency, whenever we get data back on what's happening in the pipeline, I want you to have that data. It doesn't come from me, but that's essentially, it's an informational item. If you have questions you want me to ask of NASBA coming back, that's your opportunity, but there is no real action for us to take. This is really about keeping you in the loop on the latest data that we have coming out of the exam. So that covers 8D in close to one sentence. Let's see here. All certificate payment policy change. I'm gonna see if I can write this one sentence deal for one more item. This is a little bit harder. because of the initial transition from in-house wall certificates to now having a vendor, which has worked out beautifully well, we're done with the transition. The one piece that we couldn't transition initially is that we have, because it was in-house, essentially always absorbed the internal costs of generating the wall certificate. So now I'm violating rules, sentence number 2. Sentence number 2 is, because of that, we are now the only jurisdiction of the very many that use NASBA for wall certificates, where NASBA had to change its process because every other jurisdiction simply sends folks to NASBA for their wall certificates, and if they want one, they order one. It's very simple. The board has no involvement, right? We felt really uncomfortable here internally because it took us a good while to transition stuff and folks were upset about the quality and we want to do replacements, right? We didn't want them to have to pay for it, right? And we never charged a separate fee for wall certificates, right? It was all just part of the process of, if you get initially licensed, you get your wall certificate with it. Right? So here's the ask. The ask is the board comfortable? Because we have nothing in rule covering this. There is no fee that we've ever charged for a wall certificate, right? We've essentially now borne an additional cost we have not previously had, which is the charges that NASBA normally charges to licensees are now getting picked up by us, okay? Is the board comfortable fully closing the loop to us getting essentially to the normal place where all other jurisdictions are and say, if you want the wall certificate, you simply go to NASBA and order one. And all we do with NASBA is making sure that they know who our officers are, you know, and so that the correct signatures appear, but that we essentially step out of the process the way all other jurisdictions have and not cover the costs of that certificate on the back end. Essentially, it's up to the licensee. They want it, they can order it from NASBA, we're done. And yes, I want to just make sure that that's cool, since it has been a little bit of a sensitive topic, what we're doing on wall certificates, but that's the reason for the ask. I'm sorry, that's a lot more than one sentence, but that's
Martin,
where
so
we are.
moved.
Second.
So moved. There we go.
Do we actually need a motion or just say yes?
I don't need a motion formally for this. This is an operational thing, but I want to make sure that I'm in the comfort zone.
Yes.
Yeah, makes tons of sense.
Awesome. We've done the pipeline committee chair and you're through with new business in record time, sir.
Perfect. I think
Want to do the old business?
I kind of want to do the old business just to get to a
Okay.
clean break. So I know there's people that have joined that are waiting.
what do
for
we
us to
have
go into
there?
Executive, but I want to get to.
Oh, that's easy.
That's a board calendar.
Yeah, and that's really just a reference tool for you at this point. It was updated just before the board meeting. There was a second updated version put in your materials because we just got the NASBA dates. So really, there is no changes for you. This was your moment to say, hey, we actually don't want to have a board meeting on X date because after today, it will get published on our website and kind of put it down. So if anyone still has a problem with any one of the board meeting dates that's on here, please tell us now, because we're about to publish this out. But the big one for me from a planning perspective is that coincidentally, thank God it worked out nicely for once, is that NASBA just published its conference dates. And I know that that's always really challenging for folks to plan for, because that's a pretty big time commitment. So please notice those dates, because if you're at all willing or wanting to go, right, you now have actually, unlike last year, where I think we only got like 2 months worth of warning on when the actual Western regional dates would be, we now have 6 months worth warnings. For example, Logan, I know you wanted to go last time, but then it didn't work out for you. So I'm hoping with having a lot more notice that maybe if you are still interested for the next time around, you know, but it's not just about you, it's really about everybody. You know, if whoever is thinking about going, this gives you the advance notice and it's now on that calendar. So please consider that for your calendar and planning purposes. Other than that, that's it. Okay, for all business.
All right. Well, well, what we're doing in a minute is we'll, pause the recording, grab our lunch before we enter executive session, but I think, we do have a couple of recusals here. So just before we go into executive session, I think Raul, you might have a recusal you might need to state. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's agency case 23-005. So I just want to make sure that that's on record. That was agency case 23-005.
Yes.
And then I myself am have to recuse myself from 2 inquiries. That's inquiry -026 and inquiry -025. I have a financial interest with respect to those 2 inquiries, so I'm recusing myself in executive session, and then when we come back, I will not be participating as well.
Yeah.
So,
And for those 2 inquiry numbers, those were both 2023 inquiry
yes.
numbers.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else that I'm not aware of? Any other recusals? Okay, we'll go ahead and pause the recording. We can grab our lunch and then we'll come back here in a few minutes and jump into executive and keep pushing here.
And just to put it also on the record for both the public as well as the board, when we come back into executive session, we're going to have to move anyone who's a member of the public into a waiting room unless there is business with somebody that then gets pulled in for just that portion of executive session. So we're going to have to manage that pretty tightly. So thank you, sir.